Ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, hello, wherever you are in your moment of time. This is Grant Cameron, and I have one of my first panels I want to run. I've got a number of panels that I want to do, one on orbs, one on light language, and the one I'm going to do tonight is on psychedelics. I wrote a book called Inspired the Paranormal World of Creativity, where I look at a whole chapter on psychedelics, about psychedelics being a way into the field. I'm doing another book. Desta and I are doing a book called Contact Modalities, in which we will also describe the fact that I believe that psychedelics is a contact modality. It's no different than meditation or any other sort of thing. It may be a little faster and a little more out of control. I thought this was a very important subject in terms of the research I've done on it. And if we go back to the end of the 19th century, if you remember how science was basically claiming we have now discovered everything. All we have to do now is go to 6 decimal places. That's all we got to do. We've got it all figured out. The head of the American Patent Office said, I believe it was 1916 or 17 or something, everything that has been invented, there's nothing new to be invented. Everything that has been invented. And we started with this idea that we got it all figured out, and then along comes Max Planck with quantum mechanics. He wins the Nobel Prize. Then relativity comes along. Einstein wins the Nobel Prize after we supposedly discovered everything. Then we had Bohr coming along with the quantum atom, and he won the Nobel Prize for that, and that changed everything. And then the uncertainty principle by Heisenberg in 1925, and again, everything changed again, and we started to realize that the world may not be as physical, and time and space may not be what we think it is. 1929, all these great physicists who won the Nobel Prizes in 1925 all believed there was only one galaxy. 1929, we suddenly realized, oh my God, there's more than one galaxy. And now we've gone, despite what people may want to say about channelers not being very accurate, nothing could have been more inaccurate than science saying there was one galaxy, because now they're saying there's 2 trillion. You can't get much farther off than 1 to 2 trillion. So that you had that big discovery of that we are not just some little galaxy with a couple of stars. 1947 was a big event, when the opening of the UFO event, where UFOs started to be seen. That changed the whole paradigm, and it's still changing the whole paradigm. I think it was 1943, and a lot of people call this the greatest discovery of the 20th century, is the discovery of LSD. And that's basically where we're going to go tonight. We have the 1990s, where research is done on DMT, which is the basic core drug for ayahuasca. And in the 1960s, we had a number of students taking LSD, and at that point they suddenly decided they really didn't want to go to Vietnam anymore and drop bombs on people, and it became illegal. It was made illegal. But these are some of the events, and I think the whole discovery of LSD and the psychedelics has basically changed everything in the world, if you understand what's actually going on. So that's what I want to discuss tonight. I brought in a couple of people. Desta Barnabe has a science degree from the University of Manitoba. I have Sinead Whelehan from Toronto as a degree in education. And we have Walter Rucker, who I've brought on a number of times, who's an expert in a number of the same fields I'm in. He's done a lot of stuff on mediumship, on channeling, and he has some expertise or some background in psychedelics, which I want to bring him in. And then finally, I've got Doug Auld, who's an artist in New Jersey, who is a promising upcoming Broadway musical producer. And he had, according to what he's told me, some psychedelic experiences that changed his entire the way he went and influenced his art. So I want to go through and see what people think about this, the experiences they have, and why this might be something that people should pay attention to. So I'm going to go first to Walter Rucker, and you had a discussion with Doug. We were mentioning that just before. So let's start with you, and let's get into a little bit of the history of psychedelics and why you might think this is important.
Yeah, and thank you guys for this opportunity. It's always fun, and my personal hello to each and every one of you. The history of hallucinogens actually began back in the mid-30s, and there was a fellow. He was a scientist by the name of Albert Hofmann, and Albert Hofmann was looking for some other kind of of drug that would attack respiratory problems and heart problems and things like that. And, you know, as many scientific investigations, they start in one direction and, you know, end abruptly in another. And so one day he's experimenting around and he gets a little, anecdotally, they say he gets a little bit of this formula on his hand. It was lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. And he wasn't looking for this kind of thing, and inadvertently swiped a bit into his mouth and decides that he's not feeling real well. And he's starting to get extremely anxious, highly paranoid, and it was during the war period where you couldn't ride a car home, so he got his friends to take him home because he was really getting to be worried that he had poisoned himself, because he was working with a poisonous plant called ergot, which is the base plant for the LSD synthesis. And so they jump on their bicycles, and about halfway home, he really starts to get off. And now he's in full-blown paranoia. I mean, he has no idea what's happening. Nobody's ever reported any experiences like this. He never studied the indigenous people and their plant medicines, the peyote cactus and the mescaline chemicals from that, or the psilocybin mushrooms, or any of those things. And he was completely caught by surprise. Gets home, he calls a doctor and says, "I'm dying. You know, I'm dying." And the doctor comes over and says, "You're not dying. I don't know what you are, but you're not dying." He said, "Oh, okay." So, you know, he feels less anxious now. Now he starts to have a lot of fun. And now he's laughing and, you know, having fun and calling, you know, his neighbors up, and they think he's nuts. And, you know, he's just having a real good time. Albert Hoffman Day is April 20th. We just passed it. And it's also called 420 Day, which is the numerical acronym for marijuana, cannabis products. And so it's really kind of synchronous that we would have this discussion. No accident in the experimental room for Hoffman, and we don't particularly have LSD. Matter of fact, he said, "I didn't go looking for LSD, it went looking for me." And I thought that was a pretty profound statement for the 1940s.
Yeah. Can I add something?
Sure.
Can I add something? He wasn't it the only drug out of 10,000 that he redid, that he had actually rejected it years earlier?
Yeah,
and for some reason went back and did it again.
Yeah, he that was the 30s. As a matter of fact, he didn't re-up the experiment for whatever reasons until like the mid 40s or so. So you're absolutely correct. He just put it aside and just thought, you know, wow, whatever this is not what I'm looking for. It's not what I'm getting paid for. He worked for Sandoz, and Sandoz has a long history of interaction with the Central Intelligence Agency, going back to the Mech Ultra 1 programs and Mech Ultra 2 programs, where the CIA was looking for drugs that they could induce into enemies or friends and get effects that would either be truth serums or could drive them crazy or could make them susceptible to other types of experimentation. And they were fooling around with everything. And they were using the public labs like Sandoz and quite a few others to do those things. Now, it's not like the CIA didn't have their own drugs and their own labs. Matter of fact, Sidney Gottlieb, who was a CIA biochemist, was one that really kind of purified LSD. He kind of took Hoffman's gross research and turned it into the fine tuning of it. What the Central Intelligence Agency did with that, I don't think this is argumentative at all anymore, is that they took it and they shoved it down into the campuses. The universities, private, public especially, and mostly up in the Northeast where there were higher concentrations of students and the like. And I was a 69 graduate from high school, my wife as well. And so we were in school at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, which is at the foothills of the Appalachia. It's the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, and a really strange place. But because we had so many students from the North, we were getting some taste of the illicit drugs, the illegal drugs at the time, which were primarily LSD, psilocybin from the mushroom, mescaline from the peyote cactus, DMT, which was coming from both artificial and natural means. And PCP, the latter two I have never done. And so I was always interested in especially the DMT part, and Sinead did a really wonderful interview with you, Grant, on her ayahuasca experience. But to kind of make it into the short, we jump into the 60s and the 70s, and the intelligence agencies had lots of reasons for wanting to introduce this into the public arena where they could monitor people. It was the Nixon era. Nixon very much wanted to dissuade and dishonor the protesters of the Vietnam War. The term drug came from the Nixon era. He created the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and all of this was all political, but it left us with a beginning taste in the mouth of society that drugs, as they were called back then, were bad. They were nasty, they were harmful. They had commercials where they hold an egg up and say, this is your brain. They crack the egg and they drop it to the frying pan and say, this is your brain on drugs, or something like that. But anyway, you get the point. It was a smear campaign. So here they are, the CIA under Nixon's authority are pushing these drugs into the campuses on 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds. And then turning around the other side and running a smear campaign against the people who were using the very same drugs they were injecting into the campuses. So the CIA had tremendous ability to transport drugs, as we know. For instance, American Made, a movie with Tom Cruise, was the highlight of the Barry Seal, Mena, Arkansas era. And if you want to start tying politics into drugs, guess who was the governor of Arkansas during that period of time? That's correct, Bill Clinton. So he's intimately involved in this. Mena, Arkansas is within a spit from where he grew up. He was, and Barry Seal, which is the character that Tom Cruise played in American Made, would fly in and out of there and ended up on both sides of the Medellin cartel and the DEA, and the CEA finally dumped him. They one day shot him up in his car because he was garbage to them at some particular point. It's a good movie, though, if you want to go back and look at the history of the involvement of governments and other governments outside of the United States in the drug trafficking trade. The CIA was responsible for the transportation. They were smart enough to stay out of the dealer pusher side of things. So they weren't into the distribution. They'd bring the drugs in, they'd sell them off to the mafia. The mafia would then distribute them in. And so they would have plausible deniability during this whole period of time. So in a kind of roundabout way, which is part of what you said early on, Grant, it's kind of funny, is that you could say that the intelligence agency, both military and central, were the creators of the drug movement and the creators of that huge swing, transformational swing in psyche in the American public that can be directly and particularly related to the introduction of psychedelics and psychoactive drugs like cannabis as well. So that kind of brings us to where we are today. We have drugs that are being used. See here, I'm still saying the word drugs, where you have hallucinogens that are being used for the cessation of alcoholism with high results, great results, other kinds of activities, anxiety, all kinds of stuff that we're finding now that the stigma is starting to disappear, that these are highly effective treatments for a wide variety of ailments. And the only reason that we don't have more information on that is that during the Nixon era, he criminalized millions of campus students because he made all these Class A drugs. I told Doug earlier, you know, in 1967, 68, if you got caught with a joint of marijuana, you went to jail. If you were in Texas, you went to jail for 15 to 30 years. That's not an exaggeration. I mean, that's hard to believe, considering that my wife just got her medical marijuana card, and the only thing that she had to do for it was tell an online doctor that she was anxious about a 1974 crash she had in a Pinto. So, I mean, we've come kind of full swing on this thing, and but the history is important because we went from the drug use being sacramental, which I know Sinead understands, to being recreational. That's where I was. And to now it's moving into the clinical phases again, where it's looking at it as treatments. And this is great stuff. And I hope that, with the bottom of my heart, I really do, I hope that the proper use of hallucinogens becomes mainstream medical practice. And things are going to have to change a bit before that happens. But one of the things, and I'm going to hand this over to Doug, that came up in my conversation with Doug there is that I was in an area which had very poor quality drugs. We had drugs, especially LSD, that had varying quantities of LSD per tablet or per little patch of paper. And 250 micrograms is considered a megadose of LSD. And if you weren't careful, you might pick up the wrong little tablet or get a little bit heavy on a piece of little paper, and you might have 200 or 225 micrograms of LSD in you, and this is not fun. This is not fun at all. But in the 50 to 100 microgram range, it's a hell of a lot of fun, to be quite honest with you. And Doug, we talked about the geographical differences. You were up in New Jersey, I believe, at the time, and in a more dense area, more schools and the like. I'm down there in Knoxville, Tennessee, and in the foothills of Poordom. So tell us a little bit about that, because you actually have better personal experiences that I can really attest to.
Thanks, Walter. That was a great overview. And one thing I want to make clear to everybody, sounds like a disclaimer, but it is, I was really never like a druggy guy. I was never a hangout guy and never a druggy guy. And I was never really a smoker guy because I didn't smoke cigarettes. And I didn't like inhaling anything. So there was a whole culture of people around us in high school that were smoking pot and smoking hash and doing this and doing that. And it's not that I didn't do it, it's just that it wasn't a natural thing for me. Now, Walter, I was going to a school in Hackensack, New Jersey, so I'm within a 10-mile, 10 to 15 minute trip to New York City, even shorter, actually. So I'm in a hub over here with, with a lot of so-called action, drug-wise, I guess. And I was going to high school. I was going to technical school. I was going to be an auto mechanic for my dad's business. He was a car dealer. And still am, but we may not know it, but I was kind of a shy kid. And I didn't really like hanging out with a lot of people and doing drugs. I wasn't like, hey man, and like, you know what I mean? It wasn't in me. I didn't like the whole thing. And that's why we actually have to get away from this word drugs, which is an umbrella term for every friggin' thing you can think of, including every pharmaceutical on TV. We're talking about psychedelics here. And psychedelics interested me because it was something for the expansion of my thought process. It wasn't, from what I heard about it and what I was told, it wasn't a party drug. It wasn't like make you go wild and start dancing, like, or whatever, like a lot of other things that are out there today are. And I wasn't interested in that. I'm the kind of person that would like to take it home, go in my bedroom, close the door, drop it, and look in the mirror and see what I could do with my face and everything like that. So let me just briefly tell you that one of my early experiences, and I think it's one of the ones that etched a mark in me, is I'm at my school, Bergen Tech, and I'm an auto mechanic. I'm going to be an auto mechanic. I'm not an artist, not a musician. I'm 17, just ready to turn 16 to 17 years old. And acid was going around my school. And someone said, you want to drop some acid? And I was with a friend of mine and said, well, what exactly will it do? What is that? And he said, well, it'll give you amazing colors and dreams and this and that, and everything else. And it was $5 for a tab. I remember this. And I said, okay, $5. And what he handed me would fit on the tip of my finger. It was like a little piece of paper. If it would have blown off my hand, I would have lost $5. I wouldn't know how to find it. So I'm like, all right. So I remember I just like kind of stuck it in my pocket. And I got home somehow, I think the school bus, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm not 100% sure. And I remember putting it on my tongue and under my tongue, and then just going about my business. And I really didn't think anything was going to happen. But it was like a beautiful afternoon, and I was going to mow the lawn. And we had a riding lawnmower, you know, you had to put the rope around it and pull, and it would start. And my sister, my younger sister, Doretta, was cavorting around. And I would normally not be paying too much attention to her. She was doing her thing. And I pulled the lawnmower out, rolled it out into the driveway, took the cord, went like this, it didn't start. All right, went like this, it didn't start. And then I went like this, and it went, bum, 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 bum. And the sound was like a helicopter slowly beating over my head, and everything just seemed to have a gilding glow to it. It was the strangest thing. It hit me, but so nicely, not over my head. It hit me, and I was just in like this greatest state. And I'm looking around, and I'm like, what has just happened? My arms look longer. Everything looked a little warped. The trees had a beautiful, like, living quality to them, different than normal. And I said to my sister, she's looking at me, and I said, hey, Doretta, I said, wanna ride on the mower and we'll mow the lawn? I never would have said that to her. God only knows my parents would have known what I'm doing with her on a riding lawnmower, but no one knew, okay? And we start to mow the lawn. And I'm just in absolute love with the sound, the feeling of things. And she's sitting on my lap in front of me, and we're mowing the lawn, and we go past these flowers, and she goes, you know, a natural child's imagination. She goes, look, the pansies are smiling at us. And I look down, and they're all going like this to me as I'm going by them. Like, they're like little alive little beings. It's like I saw that. I don't know if it's that she put that thought in my head or a filter opened. And that began this amazing like experience where I, on that day, where I mowed the lawn with her, we were laughing and giggling about this and that, put the lawnmower away, and then I had to go and sit down at dinner with my parents, okay? And, you know, I'm like sitting there and I'm wondering, I'm paranoid, I'm figuring everyone knows what I'm doing. Oh my God. And my father is like talking in his business way, and my mother was like saying something like very flowery. And I said, could I have the mashed potatoes or something? And I think my brother said, well, it's right in front of you. Why don't you just take it? But I just remember my arm going way out, at least 10 feet, and going and grabbing the mashed potatoes and bringing them in. I'm looking around like, what is everyone seeing? They must be seeing this long arm pulling in the mashed potatoes. And I don't know how I made it through dinner. I can't remember the entire trip. I went to bed. I just remember closing my eyes and seeing equations, numbers, things stacking up, going sideways, this and that, all sorts of digits, all sorts of like, just like a mathematical fabric behind everything, like that I was picking up on. And I was like, when is this going to stop? And I think the next day was Saturday. And this was actually what made the most profound impact on me from the LSD at first experience. I finally got through it that Saturday, and I experienced the most profound, depressive loss of ego that I didn't even know that I had something to lose, if that makes sense. I had no idea that I even had something to lose. It was that impressively depressing. I was so frightened. I thought everyone's going to see, everyone's going to know. But I felt so small. I felt so little, so insignificant. So anything that Doug thought he was or doing, or that this is great, or had an opinion about something, was destroyed. It was brought down to nothing. And it took me quite a while to get through that. I don't think I mentioned it to anybody. I think I was just, you know, probably my brother noticed something's wrong with me. We were good friends and we hung around a lot, and it was devastating. And that whole experience, from the seeing everything the way it was to that depressive state, was my first experience with something called strawberry fields. which was an amazing LSD at the time. And it was going around. Everyone talked about, oh, that's the best. You know, even later on, like 20 years later, oh, you did Strawberry Fields. That was the best stuff out there. I did that and something called Orange Sunshine and Purple Haze. Those three. I think Window Pane. I can't quite remember, but those were some of my recollections of my first LSD experience. So I could stop there if anyone wants to say anything.
I just wanted to ask you a question, Doug. I think you mentioned to me, do you think, because you started off as a mechanic and you end up as an artist and a music guy, do you think doing psychedelics shifted your career any, or would you have still become an artist?
Well, it's hard to say that I really had sort of a career at the time. I was kind of young and I was always mechanical. I've always been good with my hands. And growing up in the house, I would, my mom would say, the toaster doesn't work. And I'd be like, all right, I'll fix it. And I would grab it and fix it and do this and do that. And I remember when I was a little kid during Christmas, they brought, someone got me an erector set. And someone got me this little monster called Great Garloo, which a lot of people may remember from back in the day. It was electronic, like robot. And within no time, my mom was like, where's Great Garloo? But I was driving a car around and I said, oh, I built a car out of it. I took the motor out of it. I took the erector set, built the erector set, took the motor, and I made a car riding around. So I had mechanical skills. But I think my brother in the last year of high school, my brother Greg, was pretty good influence on me. He had to break through the family wall first because my mom and dad had no idea of the 60s coming. At that time, no one really was prepared for the changes in kids and the revolution. And, my brother went to Woodstock. I didn't go to Woodstock. I had to watch the dog. He went to Woodstock, so I got cheated on that. But I remember my brother said in my technical high school, he said, Doug, be ready Friday. I'm taking you to Philadelphia to see the Doors. I was like, oh, okay, what's the Doors? It's like a band. So I said, oh, this is going to be great. Okay, so well, I would say, Grant, that's what changed my life in combination with what door was open to me. And from that day on, I think my brother and I took a little bit of a different turn because I had been shown something that he wasn't. And it's almost impossible, Sinead would know this, and Walter, it's almost impossible to explain to someone what a hallucinogenic journey is if you haven't had it. It's almost like the near-death experiences when people come back and go, I'd like to be able to tell you how bright the light was, but I can't tell you because we don't have words. And it was sort of like that. And so it definitely started to change the direction. And when I first started painting, I would say that it really started to change it as some years went by, because I never forgot what I was read into, in a sense, or what I was made aware of. And it started to filter its way into how I saw things. So I would say yes. And I would say, in my opinion, for the better. And one of the reasons why I loved hallucinogenics is they're non-addicting. It's not something you're going to want to do today, then tomorrow, then the next day. You'd have to be nuts, unless you're Terence McKenna, but you'd have to be nuts to want to keep doing it over and over again. I would need 6 months off just to come down from what I just experienced. So it's not habitual. It's not, I don't really know the extent of the damage physically, if it has one, if you do too much of it. Timothy Leary certainly did a lot. I wouldn't know enough about the science and of that, but I would say I would say my assessment of myself is the only thing it really messed up in me is my memory. It messed my memory up, from what I can tell. And what I mean by my memory is I have a peculiar loss of short-term memory. So you don't want to play golf with me because I'm always cheating. I can't get the numbers right on the golf course or in my hockey game. All the guys laugh at me. I'm like, it's 3-2. They're like, no, it's 5-4. I'm like, oh, but I can remember every line from every movie as long as it's 10 years ago or past. And I know, I remember that. I remember the address of that film in there. So I would say it messed up my memory to some degree, but that's all I've ever really noticed as a downfall.
Wow. Interesting. Sinead or Desta, do you want to jump in? Sinead, you had the ayahuasca experience and one other experience, so you sort of understand. And I think that's an important thing to point out for people is unless you've experienced it, it's basically impossible to explain. It's not something where, because people assume they know what's going on, but people are very highly influenced by it. So one of you want to jump in on this and comment?
Sure. Well, I'm relating to Doug with what you said, Doug, about your experience of being a teenager. I was not a huge risk taker. I was not a big adventure person. I was a highly social introvert. I know that sounds contradictory, but I knew everyone. I was friendly with everyone. I could hang out in any social group, including the druggies. But I wasn't someone who was into taking risks. I was very cautious and more of an observer of other people's experiences of psychedelics or any kind of drug taking at the time. So for me, it took a long time before I got into it. And I've taken a couple. I've taken ayahuasca more than once, and I've taken huachuma, otherwise known as San Pedro, but I use the original indigenous name, the Aboriginal name, which is huachuma. It was the Spanish colonizers, who started calling it San Pedro. So anyway, that's the two that I have experienced. Then a couple of other plant medicines, marijuana and hashish, and I've always only had positive experiences on all of these things. And also totally agree that it's, the word drug is highly, highly inaccurate when referring to these. I don't see them as drugs. I don't see them as, just for me, I've never been like, I'm going to go and do this just purely for fun or at a party or to impress other people or because it's part of the social crowd. For me, it's been very much about my spiritual journey, my personal journey of, trying to discover myself more, trying to understand more, what is the purpose of my life? Why am I here? What is all this for? Like, what are we all doing? That's really what it's been about for me. Wanting to have a deeper understanding of everything and as much as possible. So my attitude going into trying psychedelics was, first of all, I was going into it much, much later in life. I didn't start smoking pot until I was in my 30s. Hash, I think I tried when I was 23 once and then didn't do it again for years and years. And ayahuasca and huachuma were both also in my late 30s. So I feel like, I needed to do a lot of personal journeying and personal work before doing that. And then that was a huge advantage, having done so much work on myself and really being a dedicated spiritual practitioner and an adventurer, not in terms of drugs, but in terms of experiences in life. That was really helpful as background going into taking psychedelics, because then I felt like, okay, I'm ready for the intensity of what this could be. I'm ready for what this could show me about myself, which is, I think, the number one concern that people have is it going to be scary? What am I going to see? What am I going to discover about myself that I might not like? So I felt ready to do that. And so that was really advantageous. So for me, it was definitely for spiritual purposes. And I went into it with that attitude. I went into it with a bit of nervousness and a bit of trepidation, but, doing it in an environment where I was around other spiritual practitioners. I was being guided through the experience. I had support. There were shamans present, that kind of thing. And it was, as Doug's saying, it's really, really hard to articulate. And I find I have described the experience in an interview with you, Grant, for example. It's on your YouTube channel, but it doesn't really do it justice, unless you are actually there having the experience yourself, what it's like. It's just really not something that's easy to explain, because you go somewhere else. Yeah. You're no longer in this reality. You go somewhere else. And actually, this is a story that I'll share right now that isn't even my own story. It's an experience my brother had. But it's one of the first times I thought, oh, that's really, really interesting. It was also hilarious, so I'll tell you it. But it was really interesting because it made me think there's got to be something to this where it's, we're actually traveling somewhere else. Like we go somewhere else consciously, right? Our consciousness, our mind goes somewhere else. So what happened was my brother was in his late teens and he was doing quite a lot of experimenting at the time. He was a raver and he was going to raves and, he was going to parties and trying all kinds of different substances. I've never been into substances. I've never even been much of a drinker. I've never been a smoker. I still don't really drink much to this day. So my brother was in this phase of his life, and he goes to this house party, and there are mushrooms going around, and somebody offers him some, so he takes some mushrooms, and then realizes that being at the house party is far too overstimulating. So he leaves and he goes outside and sits on the curb outside of the house. And a friend of his, really good friend of his, who he's still friends with to this day, was also at the house party, also took mushrooms, also felt like, I can't be in this environment with all these people and this noise. So ended up going outside to join my brother out on the curb, and they decided to go for a walk. And this is in a neighborhood where they'd never been before. They didn't know this, they didn't even know who owned the house. They didn't know whose party they were at. So they started going for a walk, and of course they're, the mushrooms are hitting them at this point, and they're off in another experience and not really paying attention to where they're going. So eventually they get lost. And this is something they still talk about. Like this experience really had an impact on them. They get lost, and so they're wandering around, and it's very late at night. So, in suburbia, and nobody's awake. People are not walking around on the streets. And so they're trying to think, how are we going to get back to this house party? So eventually they walk up and they see a pigeon on the ground, and they ask the pigeon for directions. And the pigeon gives them directions and says, okay, yep, just go down there and turn left and then turn right and then turn left and you'll be fine. And the pigeon had little human arms. So it's a pigeon body, but it has little human arms that are, kind of pumping as it's walking on the sidewalk like this. So they just think, oh, look at the cute little pigeon with human arms. Okay, thanks so much for the direction. Bye. And, they're sort of charmed by the experience. Don't think anything of it at the time. And the directions were correct. So they get back to the house. And the next day after they come down from this trip is when they realized they had both seen exactly the same thing. They'd both seen this pigeon giving them clear directions with little people arms on its body.
It must have been a homing pigeon.
Sorry, what was that, Doug?
It must have been a homing pigeon.
Yeah, they just didn't know how that was possible. Yeah. And so I heard this story and I thought, that's really interesting. Like, how is it that these two totally different people are having their own individual experiences, but together, but they both see exactly the same thing? And so that kind of really got me thinking, and I never really forgot that. And then over the years, I heard more and more people talking about having shared experiences where it was like their minds met on this other level with other people, and they would see or hear or experience very similar things. And I just thought that was really fascinating. So I did not have that experience with either of the psychedelic experiences I had with ayahuasca or wachuma, but there are some commonalities of experiences, of course. And so one of the things that happens with wachuma to a fair amount of people, I think, is that everything becomes rainbows. So for me, I started seeing the people around me. We were outdoors. We were in the Andes Mountains in Peru, and everything became rainbows, which was really extraordinary. So that was very beautiful. And you feel like with both the wachuma and the ayahuasca, both times I felt like there was a being. It wasn't like I had just taken a drug or I just drunk something. It was like there was a consciousness that was actually working on me or doing something to me, communicating with me. That's really what it felt like. It felt like there was a conscious being there with me. And so all kinds of extraordinary things started to happen with the wachuma, but it was all happening in the sky. I don't know why that is, but I just saw this insane, beautiful, amazing, incredibly vivid imagery in the sky. And it was very moving and it was very powerful. And there's more I could go into about that, but it was really quite something. And then after that was my first experience with wachuma, where I was communing with extraterrestrials who were talking to me telepathically and telling me that I was invited to come up to space with them. And I mean, prior to that, I hadn't really focused on UFOs, on extraterrestrials. I wasn't thinking about that. That was not a part of my life at all. And that experience led to a whole bunch of other experiences, which led me to be in the UFO community today. But one thing I want to mention that's particular for me, particularly important about the ayahuasca experience, is that and actually any psychedelic experience I've had, is that it's not just, it just happens while you're under the influence of the psychedelic, and then it's over, and then you have this memory of the experience. Like for me, it actually becomes integrated into who you are. It becomes integrated into your life, and it does not go away. It has ripple effects. And so one of the crazy things that happened was I came back to Toronto from Peru after having taken ayahuasca, and I had a really unbelievable experience where I was led back to being able to take ayahuasca again here in Ontario, having no idea.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's illegal here in Ontario. You cannot just go somewhere and do ayahuasca. It's completely illegal. So I had no idea where a community of ayahuasca, people who were taking ayahuasca was. I didn't have connections with anyone here who were taking ayahuasca. I didn't know where it was being done. I had no knowledge at all. And so 4 days after I get back from Peru, I'm walking down the street in Toronto with my friend Daniel, who was an American actually, and met him for the first time in Peru and became good friends. And then he ended up getting stuck in Toronto for various reasons. So he was staying with me. So we're walking down the street and I see this man ahead of me, and this man just really stood out to me for some reason. I just had this feeling like there's something about this guy. So then Daniel says he's hungry. I point out this restaurant that's ahead of us. We agree to go in there. And as we're walking towards the restaurant and this guy is simultaneously walking down the street towards us, he turns and goes into exactly the restaurant that we just said we were going to go into. And I think, okay. And so we go in and we're standing in line at the counter about to order food. And I just have this really strong feeling about there's something about this man. I'm supposed to talk to this man. And I'm thinking he's going to think I'm weird. I'm going to strike up a conversation with him out of nowhere. How can I start this conversation? So I notice he's got this really, really beautiful sort of ornate bag over his shoulder. And so I say, "Oh, that's a really beautiful bag. Where did you get it?" And he says, "Thank you so much. I got it in Turkey. I was just in Turkey." And then he says, "My wife and I just got married there. And we literally just got back, and we were going to get married in Peru, but then conditions didn't work out, so we didn't go. So we went to Turkey." And meanwhile, he's sort of looking at me, and I'm wearing this necklace that I bought in the jungle in Peru, which is a piece of ayahuasca vine that also has a precious stone on it. And so he's sort of looking at that, and I can see his face, like he's starting to sort of realize that it's a piece of ayahuasca vine. And I say, "Oh, that's so funny that you were going to go to Peru, because I just got back from Peru. My friend and I," Daniel was behind me, "we just got back from Peru a few days ago." And he again looks at my necklace, and he looks at me, and he says, "Did you by any chance do ayahuasca when you were there?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And I said, "Have you done ayahuasca?" And he says, "Yes, I have." And I said, "Do you have a connection here in Ontario?" And this is, 2 seconds after I'd met the guy, and he says, "Yes, I do." And I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to talk to this guy further. So meanwhile, our food is being made and so on. So he goes out to the back of the restaurant, and I join him. We end up talking for a while, and he tells me about this place that's about an hour outside of Toronto where you can go and people come together, and there's ayahuasca ceremonies that are being led by a North American shaman there, and it's beautiful, and we talk about it for a while, but he won't tell me where it is. And he wants to protect the privacy of the people there because it's illegal. And he doesn't know me, right? So we talk about this for a while, and I think, okay, thank you very much. Say goodbye. That's it. And I'm disappointed. I'm really disappointed. I'm thinking this was a missed opportunity. And but I still have this feeling that there's a reason why this happened. So about a month later, because I'm a big hippie, I was at the environmental conference for our school board. I was invited to go. First time I've ever been invited to go. Never had been invited to go before, because I wasn't officially on the committee. I would just help out the club at the school where I taught. And so they just randomly said, "Do you want to come?" So I went, and there was a colleague of mine there who at the time was on leave. I hadn't seen her, and this is this spring, hadn't seen her since the previous school year. And she's there because she just wanted to come. And so I say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And there's a break at the time in the conference. So we go and sit down at this bench in this kind of corner of a hallway where we have some privacy. And I say, "How are you? How are you doing?" And she bursts into tears. And I said, "Oh my God, are you okay? What's going on?" And she said, "Oh, I'm just going through some stuff." And she details what it is. And then she says, "But ayahuasca is really helping me get through it." And I'm like, okay. okay, that's so incredibly random. Like, she doesn't say, I'm taking antidepressants, I'm in therapy or whatever. She says, I'm taking ayahuasca. And so I think, okay, that's interesting. And so then she proceeds to tell me about exactly the same place that this guy, whose name was Howard, had told me about. She's going to exactly the same place. She knows exactly where it is. She can tell me where it is. And not only that, Howard is her ex-partner.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So, I mean, I've had several examples like that where it really bleeds over into my life. And it's kind of like the spirit of the plant is saying, hi, I'm still here. I'm with you. You know, so the shamans in Peru had said to us that once you accept the experience, especially if you're not just doing it for fun and you're not just doing it recreationally, you're doing it seriously and you're honoring the plant spirit, you're honoring the tradition in which it's taken. You're inviting the spirit to come in, and if the spirit accepts and gives you an experience, and well, then it's basically in you. It becomes part of you. It becomes part of your life. It becomes part of your consciousness, and it doesn't leave you, right? And all you have to do is remain open to that. Yeah. And so that was pretty much proof of that. That's true. So I've had experiences like that after taking psychedelics that really just, and while perfectly sober. And in real life, and that tells me that this has real legitimacy beyond the already incredible experience, the consciousness raising, consciousness expanding experience of being within the experience of taking it at the time, like going on a trip. It's beyond that. It's so much bigger than that. Yeah.
Walter,
go ahead.
I'm wondering if I could just, before Walter goes or Desta, I wonder if I could just trail back.
Yep.
That's amazing. And those things happen for you, Sinead, in threes. It always seems it's threes for you. But if I tail back to want to say something, when you describe it, like you said, colors and rainbows, if I describe this to somebody, somebody's going to go, well, big deal. So everything's colorful. I can get a kaleidoscope and go like this and see everything colorful. What's the big deal? What does it really do for you other than like a fun time? It's not like a clowny fun time kind of thing. And going back to some of my experiences, I remember a few things. I remember one of them was while watching TV, I was amazed how everybody on that television, on news or whoever they were, I could see right through them. I could say that's BS. That is total BS. That is empty faces chattering out a bunch of stuff that sounds good, but it's not real. And even like fancy music or something, I would say, nah, that doesn't affect me. Music that I thought used to affect me, and now I'm listening to it on the hallucinogenic, nah, it doesn't really affect me. But if I looked at a brick, and I'll never forget this, and this may tail into Grant, what maybe one of the changes in my art, I remember studying a brick, and I remember just seeing the molecules and the atoms interchanging with each other and coming apart, going back together. And I thought that I am actually watching a brick, of all things, not like art on the wall, not like wild chandelier or anything that would be great effects. I'm watching the dullest thing you could think about, a brick. And I'm fascinated with it. I'm completely fascinated with this brick. And that it's alive, it's breathing. I can see it breathing. I can see it like having a presence, like everything I believe now does, from a coffee cup to a stone to a tree to everything. And I think that breaking apart and that message to me that everything is made up of smaller things down to infinity got into my artwork. And then, when you see my 2,255 hand-painted butterflies, making one big butterfly, that's an expression of that. And my Jim Morrison out of fish swimming in different directions, thinking about the fact that here come all these fish this way, some at you, some leaving you, going all different directions, and synchronizing only if the viewer is in this point of view, because if the viewer is over here or over here, you won't see it. So it's like a magical moment in time. And this is how my mind started to think. And then I took all this into my art as things went further. So yes, doing it once, and I did it many times, but I'm just saying that I agree with you, Sinead, that I think doing it once isn't like getting on a roller coaster ride and you're done, you get off and you come down off it, and next week the roller coaster ride really isn't in you any longer. This gets into something in your spirit, and kind of alters your trajectory.
It alters your perception, and
Yeah.
not just when you're in the experience, it permanently alters your perception.
So Walter, maybe, or Desta, or, you know.
Let's get Desta to jump in.
Well, I don't know. I don't know exactly what to say, but I had the same similar experiences as you guys did when I was younger. I was in the group of people, I guess, that were big druggies, I guess, of the school. So we did a lot of, you know, in those days, so like the 90s or 80s, I guess that was a lot of, you know, smoking weed and hash and oil and stuff like that all the time. And I actually had my first out-of-body experience after smoking oil one night at a party, and I was very young, possibly 15 years old, maybe 14 even, and so I had literally no idea what was happening, but that was due to the, you know, the altered state of consciousness I guess I was in at the time. But yeah, we did a lot of that when I was really young, and we did mushrooms, and there was acid, and, you know, all sorts of things. Especially in those days, there was lots of times when we would be doing anything, even just smoking weed, and people would say that it was everyone would start tripping, and we had no idea why it was, like, you know, so extraordinary this one night, and then we'd find out, oh, it was laced with angel dust this last batch that we got or whatever. And I had some pretty hardcore hallucinations and like bad trips from stuff that I wasn't aware of what I was taking, but a lot of very good ones from, you know, doing mushrooms and stuff when I was young. But yeah, I agree with everything that you guys are saying, and definitely I was too young, I think, when a lot of that was happening. Now I am in a totally different mindset, and of course much older, and I started doing microdosing and stuff now with mushrooms, and I'm a big fan of cannabis at the time, like right now, and so I use it more like when I was a kid, and a lot more social and in parties and stuff like this all the time. And that's what we were using it for, of course, is just to be partying and you know, hanging out or whatever. But now I find, trying to get to a different, more spiritual connection. I often meditate after, to try to, to get some kind of expanded, different place or reality, or trying to experience something different. And I definitely think that it's, like you guys are both saying, whether you're, you know, looking at art or listening to music, the experience can be enhanced so much that it actually ends up making huge impacts in your life, I think. And yeah, so I think that for trying to figure out what's going on in these other worlds or other realms or other parallel dimensions or whatever it is, I spend a lot of time trying to open my mind and meditate and try and get into the space where I can try to experience something else that's totally unrelated and different than here, but also be leading it consciously, with intent, leading the experience myself to try and, you know, either figure out stuff or get more information about something, or, you know, just have a different experience and try and bring something back, and try and, like, you know, see the other beings that I'm with in these other places or whatever. And obviously, as you guys are saying, you know, it's very hard to explain and to show to other people. But I think that it's there's a lot of time dilations while doing these kind of things, and I think that there's times where it literally feels like you could be living multiple lives when it's a very short amount of time. And I feel like what you can bring back from an experience like that feels to me, when I come back, is literally like a lifetime's of experience that's all wrapped up into, you know, something that you can't even really remember and grasp that good once you're back. But I think that it feels like it is doing something and changing my, well, of course, perspective, my reality, but my physical, you know, DNA maybe, or something. It feels like I'm changing as I'm having these experiences that is very, like I said, hard to remember, hard to describe, but I can feel it. I still feel it when I'm back, and I can feel it for a long time, and I've changed, and I can tell that I've changed from having these, you know, mystical experiences or whatever. And so in my perspective of you know, drugs, doing this kind of thing, if you're doing it, and of course for the millions of health you know, effects of it, and I have many problems, and back problems and sleeping problems and restless leg and all this stuff, so I you know, used to be using cannabis especially, and CBD and all that kind of stuff for though, like, to be able to actually get a good sleep, and or, you know, decrease the pain or whatever. But I think that there's lots of experiences that can be had with these things while taken, even if you're trying to get some kind of health benefits from it at the same time as well. But I think that the mystical part of it is something that is yeah, very hard to explain, and but very beneficial. And I think that if you're going at it in that kind of way with intent and trying to learn something from it, or trying to, you know, elevate your consciousness or expand your, you know, whatever, I think that yeah, in my opinion, very beneficial.
If you were going to talk about gateway psychedelics, which one that you have tried gave you the best sort of entry into the other world, if you want to call it, or because you're very intuitive, and that may have been part of it, but which one would you say you learned the most from?
Me?
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm a big fan of cannabis recently, and I think that you can steer, in my opinion, and I haven't done a lot of like heavy, high dosage psychedelics for a long time, but the microdosing, I think, is almost the same as just smoking weed, where you're starting to tap into something that is more easily directed, instead of being taken somewhere where you may or may not be probably still having the experience that you need to have, definitely, I think. But I think that these either smaller dosages or lighter kind of, you know, dosing kind of lets you be able to think of what you want to do and lead it, and be conscious enough to be leading your experience the entire time. Where when I was younger and doing you know, psilocybin or LSD or whatever, I mean, I had, you know, you don't really have that much control. You're kind of at the mercy, and that might be beneficial in totally different ways, I do think. But I think now for myself, I can lead it myself. And I think that feels like, maybe because I'm older as well, but I mean, it feels like it's more beneficial. So yeah, I don't know.
I want to go back to Walter, because you went through the history, but you didn't go really through the experiences that you and your wife had. And I want to add a component to this. As you probably know, I haven't really done any of these. Well, we'll try to catch up on that, but I haven't done any of these things. But I've done a lot of research on people who have done them. And I do the whole invention thing. Like, for example, I do a lot of AA stuff that people get upset about. Bill Wilson was one of the two guys that developed AA. And he got into LSD in the 1950s. And, you know, a lot of psychiatrists are using LSD in the 1950s for depression and stuff. And it was discovered, and Wilson claimed that alcoholism, he wanted AA to start using LSD for alcoholism. That 59% of all people who took LSD, a high dose of LSD, in the 1950s never touched a drink again. And of course, AA would have nothing to do with this at all. And the other thing that Bill Wilson was famous for was he claimed that the 12 steps and the 12 traditions, that the book that was written for AA he was a trance channel. He was like Edgar Cayce, and that he claimed that he had got it, the book, from a 15th century monk by the name of Boniface off on a Ouija board. And so they were into this sort of thing, and the same as I did a lot of writing on computers and Silicon Valley, the development of the computer in Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of claims on a lot of people in Silicon Valley who maintain the only reason we have a computer today is because of LSD. That they had all the money, and all the research money was on the East Coast in Harvard and MIT and stuff, but it was all the computer stuff was created on the West Coast, because they had the LSD was moving around the Berkeley campus and stuff like that. And they talked about even the Hewlett-Packard was using LSD in their inventions. They had their engineers sitting down every night, and they were giving them LSD and seeing what they could come up with in terms of inventions. And the guy who invented the computer, I'm actually going to post this on Facebook, the guy who actually was the creator of the computer is 1950, and he had an experience where he sort of just zoned out when they gave it to him, and they tried to stop him at Hewlett Packard from taking the LSD, and he kept changing seats because they were only going to give him a half a dose because they didn't want him to freak out like he'd done the first time, and he kept moving because he wanted to try this again, and he ended up doing the big Berkeley demonstration of the mouse. He's the guy that created the mouse, 1967 at Berkeley, and so you see this sort of creative aspect of people bringing back stuff using LSD. So can you go a little bit through your experiences, you and your wife's experiences, in terms of good experiences, bad experiences? Did it change your life? Did it put you on the path that you're on right now? Because I always look at, when I look at all this kind of stuff, I see these people who sort of, they shift, they have this thing that follows them. Their life is never the same after they do it, and it's usually in the positive vein.
Oh, Grant, there's absolutely no doubt about that. And I can trace back to my wife and I and our first hallucinogenic experiences. And let me kind of frame this for you a little bit. My sister is deceased, but she was 10 years older than I was. My brother-in-law is approximately 5 years older than I am. So we're almost generational, my brother-in-law and I. He ended up being Senate Pro Tem and good friends with Willie Brown, mayor of San Francisco, and went that whole materialistic path. And we come back from school after having our hallucinogenic experiences, which we were doing it for recreational reasons. And the only journey that we had was spiritual, was to go get some more drugs. So so we come back and we sit down and we try to have this conversation with my brother-in-law, and there's no connection. I mean, I might as well have been talking to a wall, and he might as well have been talking to the moon. I mean, we just absolutely couldn't connect. So even though we were using it recreationally, just to have fun and a good time and all that, it affects you on a consciousness level, and it changes you. And so I went away with penny loafers and short hair and a buzz haircut and all that kind of stuff. It came back, with long hair and blue jeans and my butt hanging out of my britches. So, I mean, it completely changed us. And I think because we've been together coming up on almost 50 years now, we can look back and say that was a real turning point in our life. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Now, just something a little funny. Sinead was talking about the pigeons and whatnot. I had my best friend in college. We were members of a fraternity, and this wasn't the Southern, tie, coat and tie type of fraternity. This was Animal House squared. And I mean that very literally. This place was a zany collection of the most unbelievable people that you'd ever want to meet. John Smucker, who of the Smucker family, came down to Tennessee. For some reason, he leaves the family up in Pennsylvania. He's a rich kid. He comes down. In 3 months, he couldn't take it anymore. He was a Quaker, and by the time we got through with him, he was done for. And then we sent him back, and we never heard from him again. But we absolutely changed his life. I think that's why his jelly got better, but that's beside the point. But no, it really did. But we, in that 5-year period between 1964, my brother-in-law and I went to almost the same parochial school. We went to the same high school, literally the same high school. He went to Tulane and went out to USC out in California. I go to Knoxville in Tennessee. We come back, and just because there was that 4 or 5 year period, and because of the recreational drug use of psilocybin and mescaline, which were our primary pure forms that we could get, we were just completely disconnected. He was totally materialistic. We were just going, what the heck, and it was that's when we started to realize that what we were doing recreationally was changing us on what we didn't call it a conscious level back then, but it made us different people, and it changed us, forever since. It changed the way we raised our children. We were very honest with them, very truthful about our relationships with illegal drugs. It really set the tone for our marriage in a lot of respects. Now, here's a funny thing. Nixon forms the DEA in 1972, whatever it is. And we're from Memphis, Tennessee. Now, we know Elvis Presley like he's a brother there, because literally he would drive up in his motorcycle. My wife used to see him drive up his motorcycle and pump his gas, and they used to talk to him like a regular person. I'd go to the park and watch him play football. He's an excellent athlete, great moves. And so we would do, so he was just like one of the Memphis clans. It was no big deal, and he's heavy in drugs, and everybody knows it in Memphis. And so Nixon, in his ultimate wisdom, puts him as head of the DEA, makes him a deputy. He deputizes him. And you can see the pictures on the internet. He's, Elvis is there and he's putting the sheriff's pen on. It's just real. We're just going, well, this is absurd. This is absolutely one of the most absurd things we ever had. So, that we go through that kind of thing. We're just going, what is this? There's a little town south from here. And Nixon decided that he was going to show his, hello, kitten. He was going to show his, power of the DEA and the power over liberalism and all this other stuff. Little towns in Everglades City. It's only 400 people then. It was only 400 now. He goes down there and sicks the DEA on them. I mean, this little bitty town stuck in what's called the 10,000 islands of the Florida, southwest corner of Florida. Literally just clumps and clumps of little islands, so they would fly the drugs in there and dump them into the water. The guys in Everglades City would get in their canoes and go through all these mangrove trees, and it's sort of like the Amazon jungle, and they'd only know the routes. They pick the drugs up and bring them back. Well, that finally hit the DEA's radar. They sent them in, and they arrested 3/4 of the males in that town. 3/4, wow. And that's why today it still only has 400 or 500 people. They put almost the entire male population in jail down there. I mean, this is how absolutely absurd it was. But getting back to points of things. Oh, Sinead, my best friend. He's president of the fraternity. I give him a hit of acid. He's going to a 3-hour class, 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock in the evening, right? And so at the halfway break they have. A break. They have a break at 7:30 or whatever it was. And I said to him, look, Henry, don't take the acid. Wait till you leave class before you take the acid. Now, it was an English oratory class. He's an English major. He's got to do well in this class. So what does he do? He goes to the bathroom, he drops the acid, right? So he goes back into class. The teacher says, hey, you, come here. He doesn't know what's going on. He goes, hey, you come here. I want you to stand up in front of the class and read and comment on this, English oratorical piece. He gets up in front of class, and to this day, he's now deceased. But when we used to talk about it, he had no idea what he said. He has no concept of what he says. Sooner or later, they just kind of let him out of the class and put him out in the hallway. He walks down the hallway to leave to come back to the fraternity house, which is half a mile away. And he turns the wrong direction. So he's like your brother. He's going around in circles, and he's in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden, we're wondering where he is. It's 9:30. It's 10 o'clock. What the hell is what's that? And so we look up the street. And this is a 4-lane street, but it's blocked on both sides with cars because the students don't have anywhere to park. So it's 1 lane up and 1 lane down. He's walking down the upcoming traffic. And he has no idea where he is, what he's doing. And the cars are honking at him, and he's walking down the thing. And we're sitting there watching him. And one of my fraternity brothers says, you think you ought to go get him? I said, no, let him have fun. So he finally makes it back to the class, back to the fraternity house. And if anybody has had a hard time on a trip, because it can be very physically exhausting as well. Yeah. Doug was saying, it's not something you can do every day. It'll physically knock you out, because some of these trips will last 12 to 24 hours.
Yep. Especially
if you don't know what the dosages are, and you kind of pop yourself up one. And so he just comes in and he just falls out on the floor, and we just left him there. I think we picked him up the next morning or so. It's just like, but no, it is. And it affects you on a consciousness level. So when Sinead and Desta and Doug are talking about it becomes a part of you, it absolutely becomes a part of you. It becomes as much a part of you as your upbringing, if you have a religious background, all these things that are major themes in your life. When you start into the hallucinogen, it becomes a major theme in your life. And I've loved hearing about Sinead's encounters, because that's something that I haven't done. I never saw the machine elves, Desta, because I never got close enough to DMT to do it. I haven't got the guts to go do an ayahuasca thing. It'd probably kill me at my age anyway. So, but the point is that it's like Doug said, you can't even begin to tell somebody what it's like, because it affects you at the soul level, and it affects you at the spirit level. One other piece, I was very fortunate in that I had a cousin who was about 10 years my age older, and she became a heroin addict. Now this is late 50s, early 60s, something like that. I mean, what was heroin? I mean, it was just one of those things only rich kids did. She married a guy that owned a bunch of Ford dealerships. He had to sell all his Ford dealerships to support their habit. But we had this, I had that introduction to it. And it never occurred to us to even begin to think to move over, speaking of gateway type drugs that we used to talk about. Marijuana, excuse me, marijuana will lead to this, and this will lead to that, and that will lead to heroin, and then you're dead. I mean, it was all a lie. And the bottom line of it is that in that experience with that, and then coming up in the rock and roll era of the, especially hard rock and what was called acid rock eras in the 60s and early 70s, John Kay had a band called Steppenwolf. And a lot of the bands, Grant, as I'm sure you know, with all the work you've done with them, they were very pro-hallucinogenic, very pro-cannabis, and very anti-cocaine and very anti-heroin. And Steppenwolf wrote a song called Pusher Man, actually it was on the Monster album. And the lead-off words were, I've smoked a lot of grass and I've done a lot of pills, but I've never done anything my spirit would kill. And he was talking about the fact that he'd stay away from these things. And he'd say, GD the Pusher Man, and he'd swear and have this long interlude where you'd sit there and just, be stoned and listen to him. It really affected us in the fact that we began to understand that there was a significant difference between doing an addictive chemical like heroin, Dilaudid, morphine, any of those that fall into that category, and the non-addictive but highly persuasive and life-changing, consciousness-changing drugs like the hallucinogens.
Oh, okay, Sinead wanted to say something. Go ahead, Sinead.
Yeah, just on the note of talking about how, it stays with you, it becomes part of you, it changes you, and it has a permanent effect even while you're no longer inside the experience. A lot of people say that, and I would say this too, that you take a psychedelic, you have the experience with that plant spirit, and you are profoundly affected by it, and then you come back to so-called reality, and then you can no longer remember what that was like. For example, the experience of suddenly knowing the answer to everything. A lot of people say that they have this incredible understanding somehow while they're inside the experience of understanding the nature of the universe, or understanding, the purpose of life. And then when they come back to so-called reality, they can't remember it anymore. I think, for me, I really believe that we don't actually forget it. I think that we come back to this plane of existence, and this plane of existence is so distracting. We have to work, we have to pay bills, we have to function on a certain level in we have to keep on trucking within daily life and clean up our rooms and do laundry and run errands and stuff like that. That doesn't really help us connect to consciousness or higher vibration. So I think it's so distracting being in this plane that we think that we can't remember it, and maybe we can't remember it, like we can't consciously just go back there and access it really easily unless you're a really, really skilled practitioner or a really skilled meditator or something. But I really believe that we don't actually forget it. I think that it becomes so much a part of us, that part of us that is actually the pure, real, true part of who we really are, which is consciousness that's connected to everything, that's where it lands, and that it stays there, and it is always there, and it does influence us from that place. And I think that it's possible to reconnect with that, but that would have to be through maybe an ongoing practice of taking psychedelics, or an ongoing, really disciplined spiritual practice, which of course, anyone who is a regular spiritual practitioner and really pushes their limits of where their mind can go, where their spirit can go. It's limitless, right? You can keep expanding, and you can keep enhancing your ability to connect when you want to, rather than maybe it's just spontaneously happening to you, or happening to you only when you're under the influence of psychedelics. But I really believe that, we might think that we've forgotten it, but we really don't. I think that it lives in us. It is there. Once we invite it in, it's part of us. And I think part of that is because it is a plant, and we are one with nature. We live in this culture where we think that we're not. We think that we are disconnected from nature. We think we are separate. We think that we're human, and this is our society and our culture, and nature is this other thing that we can go and visit, but not, or we go to a park and experience nature or something like that. But the truth is that we are nature. Nature is us. We are connected to everything. So the plant is a consciousness, I believe, a consciousness, a spirit. And then once we connect with that it's not something that goes away or that we forget about, because it is us. We are it. We are nature. Nature is us. It's all the same thing to me.
Beautiful. I want to welcome Courtney Marchesani, who just finished her master's in body-mind medicine. We've been talking about people's experiences with the various psychedelics, and which ones give you the sort of the enlightenment. Based on your experience with body-mind medicine, and you and I were discussing this recent interviews with Andrew, whatever. Gallimore, yeah, about DMT, and that was the question I was going to pose to people. Like, how many people have that? Because we're in the UFO community, so everybody always says, what are UFOs? Who's in the UFOs? And when you have the DMT experience, you interact with actual beings, like whether you call them elves or whatever. And that's what Strassman had shown in 1990s. He suddenly discovered in the DMT experiment that half the people had seen beings, and he was asking them, have you ever been abducted? And he was trying to figure out, like, why everybody's seeing these beings. So maybe you can comment on your take on psychedelics, based upon the lot of work that you've done in terms of body-mind medicine.
Yeah, well, just to give a little bit of context, I know we're in the UFO community, but one of the things that's emerging right now in field studies is what Terence McKenna was talking about when he talked about the elves inside the machine. And people who have followed his work, he touches on consciousness and talks about our culture being addicted to alcohol, meat, and all these various things that we use to soothe our whatever it might be, existential angst, depression, anxiety. So from a mind-body perspective, there's so much happening right now, especially in terms of consciousness studies and psychedelics. And just kind of hearkening back to what Terence McKenna was talking about. And Terence McKenna also talked about you remember he talked about being a psychonaut, and he talked about Jung's work, and he talked about the collective unconscious, and he talked about archetypes. And so the other thing I really like about Terence McKenna, just touching on this and kind of bringing into modern times, is, he talked a lot about that only takes you so far. Jung is only going to take you so far. The collective unconscious and studying that, whereas you're talking about in this community, people who have experienced other types of intelligences, they have similar patterns in terms of their contact. And you talk, Grant, specifically about contact modalities. Well, psychedelics are one aspect of that. And we're seeing in emerging field studies in consciousness a lot of incredible data about depression, ketamine. We're seeing, DMT. The thing with DMT is that, it works off the visual cortex in the brain. And so one of the things that I've been looking at from a mind-body perspective is how the visual cortex with certain neurotransmitters processes the visual field. So hallucinations, if you shut down certain aspects of the visual cortex, or there's a disability, or there's, like, say, a tumor in certain aspects of that visual cortex, people have hallucinations where they see anomaly, or they don't recognize faces. And so the thing that I think that's so interesting about DMT and the neurotransmitters are people have this holistic experience. It's not a hallucination that is marked by a disorganized thought process. When you take DMT, it's a holistic, meaningful experience for the person who's going through it. The thing that I think is very similar to DMT and the neurotransmitters that are involved and the experience that people undergo, which is holistic, it has meaning, it's personal to them, they experience beings or entities that have messages for them that are personal and are healing, and sometimes people feel a reduction in symptoms, specifically trauma, things from the past that they're able to move through and feel transpersonal experience from. So from mind-body perspective, DMT can be really positive when it's used that way in a holistic medicine. The thing I also think is interesting about DMT and its connection to shamanism, if you look at mind-body medicine and consciousness and shamanic perspectives, is that individuals who go through that are healers have a similar experience to people who have contact experiences. They feel wide, expanded openness of consciousness. It usually follows a pattern where they're connected by a guide, a spiritual entity, or a teacher. And so there's these similarities that experiencers or people in the UFO community have that are very similar with people who go through DMT experiences. And you can't neglect that or ignore it. And the emerging field studies on DMT clearly shows this, that there are deep healing aspects in the psyche, like what Terence McKenna was talking about. And now they're studying it from a clinical standpoint. I mean, it's phenomenal. I think we're in phenomenal times to see how consciousness is shaped, how symptoms can be reduced clinically by uses of psychedelics.
Yeah. You probably read the stuff from Roland Griffith, who runs the high dose psilocybin, which has the same sort of thing where, I mean, it's a pretty heavy trip. They're using pure psilocybin and high dose, and they have the monitors in the room. But they talk about this thing. I think what you're talking about is usually when a person has whatever bad habits they have, there's literally nothing you can do to turn it around. And yet, the way they describe it is it basically rewires the brain. So you have somebody who's highly depressed will take one high dose psilocybin session lasting about 6 hours, and they are completely cured. I mean, they're basically, it's gone, and so they say it's one of the few items, and I guess DMT would be the same sort of thing, where they describe it as rewiring the brain, just cleaning the brain out and setting it to start again.
It's called neurogenesis, and the thing that they've studied with DMT that's a phenomenon of DMT alone in the way the neurotransmitter works when you take it for that brief period of time, it kicks in neurogenesis. So the really phenomenal thing about DMT is that somehow the brain is able to sense it, the neurochemical, and the brain does kind of reset itself. So I liken the comparison to, you know how all these people are really into fasting right now, and they're talking about the autophagy, which basically resets the cells because it goes into die-off mode. It's a similar kind of process with neurogenesis, and that the neurons are reset, and the brain seems to be able to go into a mechanism where it recognizes through the DMT experience, I need to reset myself. So I think that that's a really fascinating healing mechanism within DMT particularly, and that psychedelic where neurogenesis has been connected to it. They've shown it.
Beautiful. I'll go to Sinead, and then I want to come back to you to see, you finished your master's and you're looking at doing some stuff. Maybe you've got some stuff that you want to do that's related that you can tell us about your next project. So go ahead, Sinead.
Yeah, just talking about the rewiring of the brain, it's making me think about three of the people that were on retreat with me for my first ayahuasca retreat in Peru. All three of them were men. One of them was Australian, one was from France, and one was from the United States. And all three of them came, we come together, people from all over the world, you come together at the retreat center, nobody knows anybody else. You spend 2 or 3 days getting to know each other, and then you go into starting the ayahuasca ceremony. So when we're getting to know each other, we're sitting around chatting and we're having circles and sharing, why are we here? What's motivating us? And all three of them said, well, I'm a drug addict. I've been struggling with drug addiction for a very, very long time. They all talked about having drug addiction for at least 15 years minimum. And you know, I'm really suffering. I don't want to live this way. I don't want to have this addiction. I really, really want to stop feeling this compulsion to do drugs. And you know, I keep thinking I'm done with it, and then it comes back to me. And so one of them in particular is standing out to me in my memory right now. His name was Kevin, who was Australian, and he was really miserable. Like, you could just see it. He was really deeply unhappy. And what had happened was he'd gone from doing hard drugs, like street drugs basically, to becoming addicted to painkillers and antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, which he was told by the medical establishment, this is going to make you better, this is going to bring you relief, this is going to make you happy, this will get you off drugs. But really it just brought him from one kind of addiction to another, and it didn't actually make him any happier. And so he was really suffering from feeling that conflict of, you know, medical experts, doctors, people we're told to trust in terms of our health and our well-being, have told me that I need to be on these medications in order to get over this addiction and the traumas I've gone through in my life. But it's not really actually helping me, but I'm afraid to go off them, because if I go off them, I'm afraid I'm going to go back to this other stuff. So he was very conflicted. And also what happened, what was happening for him was physical manifestations of his suffering, essentially. So one of the things was that he had this really, really terrible rash that was going practically all the way down his legs, and we could see it clearly. You know, he was constantly scratching. He had to constantly put ointment on it several times a day to try to relieve the itching and so on. So what ended up happening for him and the other two guys was all three of them had an incredibly similar experience when they were taking the ayahuasca, which was that a snake would arrive in their body, and the snake would be moving around in their body. And they said it was awful. You know, it was a terrible experience. It was terrifying, feeling like there was actually a snake inside their body. But what was interesting was the fact that, first of all, it happened to all three of them, and they were the only ones in the group who were drug users, who were had drug addiction. And the symbolism of the snake is incredibly important in Peruvian history and culture, and in terms of shamanism. But also that, you know, in the snake is a symbol of healing, of medicine, and many, many other ancient cultures. And it was only these three guys who were having the same visualization night after night after night, and having this incredibly intense experience of physical purification, which ayahuasca does to you. So then after the ceremonies were finished, we have 2 days to chat about, you know, how do we feel? And Kevin was like a different person. And he also noticed, all of us noticed, his rash was completely gone. He'd had it for 20, 25 years. Nothing had ever helped. He'd constantly tried different kinds of ointments and medicines and all kinds of different things. And nothing got rid of this rash. And within a few days of taking the ayahuasca ceremony, which was 4 times for him, and having these incredibly strong visualizations of this snake purifying his body, the rash was completely gone. And I've stayed in touch with him ever since, which is almost 3 years ago, and the rash has never come back. So it also makes me think about how, when our minds are rewired by letting ourselves have these experiences of this medicine, because I see it as medicine, it's not recreational for me, as I was mentioning earlier, the mind then influences the body, right? So the way the mind behaves and the way the mind changes, the body will also change, and the body will also behave differently. And so he became healthier. His rash was gone, never came back. It was just really, really extraordinary. You know, he could not believe it. And he was off his prescription medications, the opioids and the antidepressants, immediately off it, has never gone back on it. And now he is training to be a shaman, living in Peru. You know, it absolutely transformed his life. It was really quite something. So it makes me think about how in our society and our culture, we're so attached to our bodies, right? We think that if we do certain things to the body, like if our hair looks right and we have the right shaped body and we do this and we do that, it's all about the physicality, then we're going to be happy. And nobody's really paying attention. Well, not enough people are paying attention to expanding the mind, the health of the mind, and in ways that are still deemed alternative, right, outside of antidepressants and therapy and that kind of thing. But it's just fascinating to me how, when you allow yourself to go to that place of experiencing the healing of these incredibly powerful plant medicines, your body also responds to that. It's not the other way around. It's not what you do to the body that makes your mind happy. It's what you do to your mind that changes your physicality as well.
Beautiful. Before we go back to Courtney, Doug wanted to jump in and mention some stuff.
Yeah, and listen, Sinead, it's a very important thing that you say, and I want to make sure anybody that watches this gets this, is that I'm an anti-drug guy. I'm not for drugs under that umbrella called drugs. And the time that I was doing the hallucinogenics and growing up, I was also playing ice hockey. You'll like this, Grant. And so 3 days a week of ice hockey had me waking up at 6 in the morning, and my friends were leaving the house at 3 in the morning to go out at night. And I was like, I didn't even understand that concept. I'm like, you're going, and they'd be like, Doug, where are you going? It's 11:30, 12 o'clock. I'm like, I'm going home. They're like, you wouldn't even get going yet. Where are you going? Well, I was going home to play hockey, and I got used to waking up every morning at 6:30 in the morning to play ice hockey. This band of guys that I knew were coke heads, and they were going into the city, and they were pounding it out with cocaine. And cocaine, in my opinion, ruined my sister's life. I despised this drug. I never did it. I just despised what it did to my sister, and I've despised what I've seen it do to our culture. It's addictive. It's the cause of crime, huge crime. Hallucinogenics aren't. They're not the cause of any crime. I mean, in dealing, what can you make? What you can make on a tab of acid or something like that? It was nothing. So it ruined my sister's life, and the ego that it inflates in people. In fact, that's the very thing that its hallmark is, according to the users that I know, is that, oh, I got to get another bump. I got to get another bump. I need to be higher. I'm going to go up and talk to that woman. Let me get a bump, and boom, boom, boom. And it's like, and then you come down off of that, and the thing you need is more. Well, you can't confuse hallucinogenics with this and that. And that's why it's totally different. That's one of the things I wanted to say. I am totally against, and then moving it to heroin, where it's like you absolutely need it. In fact, you need it just to get back to ground zero prior to using it. I mean, otherwise you're going to go into withdrawal and depression and everything else. And none of this has anything to do with hallucinogenics. And one of the things I wanted to circle back with that Walter had mentioned, and I never gave this any thought, but my father was a very sort of like the wizard, behind the curtain, the wizard behind the curtain in his chair, and Saturday and Sunday, and don't bother him. And he's reading his New York Times. And it was like hallowed ground if we ever went over there and like bothered him with something. Me as a dad, my son, his mom passed away, but I am completely the opposite. And this is not a knock on my father. My father was the greatest guy in the world, and he's coming from a different time frame. Came out of the Depression, the whole thing. But my son and I, the way I raised my son, and I think, Walter, you mentioned it, was so ridiculously honest that I almost diffused the father-son positioning, because we're like the best friends. We'd be like going out and going places, and people thought we were brothers or something. Nobody really would ever think I'm his father, the way we interacted. And I realized this is diametrically opposite to the way my father was a father to me, the way I think I saw my brother a father to his daughter, the way I was with my son. And I never really gave it any thought that it could have been a residual from my experiences with the LSD, because I somehow got the message that things are not what they appear to be. Nothing. The roles we play, the positions we are, the suit we wear, the exterior we wear. And so, if you see my art on my website, I did a whole series of nuns and priests making a comment about the uniform and our exterior. And I painted a nun with toenails painted in a Star Trek mug looking out the window. And I was basically trying to say, she's just a woman, and she's got a nun's outfit, but the outfit is so powerful. A cop's outfit is so powerful. You see a person in a five and dime or a little coffee shop, and it's a cop in the blue and the whole thing. And then you see the same guy the next day in his regular clothes. It's like a completely different reaction, because we carry these exteriors, we carry these uniforms. And I caught on to that very early in my life. And I said, this is a total illusion. And I think Walter, it's very possible that experience, I never thought about it, but those experiences changed the way I fathered my son, and it's all for the better. And if my son came on here, he would tell you that. So I just wanted to come back to talk about that.
Beautiful. Okay, we're going to go to Courtney to talk about what you're working on, because I think you're working directly in this field. And I want to make sure that we, if I don't forget, Sinead is going to talk about an event tomorrow. It's a tribute to Terence McKenna, and Dennis McKenna is on there. And a lot of the big name psychedelic people who've done the research are online like this tomorrow. So we can give you the link to go there if you want to join in with Dennis McKenna, who has been sort of a god of, you know, pharmacology and watching this whole thing, and his brother and stuff. So go ahead, Courtney, with what you're working on and how it ties into what we're talking about tonight.
Well, thank you, Grant, and thank you guys all for allowing me to be on here tonight, because I feel like I just got invited into the big cosmic circle. I feel like I've been, you know, really working hard on this stuff for many years, but when you get invited into the circle, things seem to open up even more and expand even more consciousness-wise. I'm speaking about. I am so excited that you mentioned the McKenna brothers, because when I read Food of the Gods, one of the things that really hit me was so profound, and I know that this wasn't Terence McKenna's, I think that he got it from somebody else, was that humans ran into mushrooms and just, you know, ate them because they were in the, you know, the foliage, and that was a consciousness expanding moment. And so I just wanted to go back and touch on that in terms of this conversation, because I thought that was brilliant. I thought that was brilliant, that humans live in the environment and are part of nature. We're part of it in the hierarchy, and that our brains, and look at the endocannabinoid system and, you know, cannabis. I mean, for a long time, there was no research about the endocannabinoid system in the body and how certain types of THC interact and certain types of cannabis interact with the body, with the brain. I mean, it's phenomenal that we have the science now to really dig down on this stuff and study it. The other thing I wanted to circle back around on with the DMT conversation in the lead-in is that it's not just DMT in terms of this endogenous that's in the brain. It's also an MAOI. So there's serotonin that's connected with it. And it's a very complex neurotransmitter that we do have. And so it does seem like these things are cohabitate in nature with us. The beautiful thing about the shamanic perspective, as I've learned it in my training in terms of mind-body medicine and through an apprenticeship with a shamanic teacher, is that we are connected in the web of life through all the animals, through the plants, and that DMT is a profound thing that people are waking up to right now. And you see so many people talking about it and doing it on their own time, but it's not something to be taken lightly in terms of the healing process. I know that you all on this call understand this, but that it is not a recreational drug. DMT is a drug that you take for that breakthrough. This is how I look at it in terms of my own perspective and how I've understood plant medicine and hallucinogenics, is that you take it with a serious intention to do that transformative work and break through the patterning of whatever is there that you feel like you haven't been able to do by yourself. And the plant helps you get there. And not only that, it's rooted and grounded in an ancient Amazonian practice that shamans are trained for years to guide people through a sacred ceremony. So the only aspect that I think is a little scary as it's kind of hitting critical mass right now is that people are undergoing DMT experiences without that sacred aspect. I mean, but you see that taken, Amazonian medicines taken and used without the sacredness of it. But I think that's one of the things that I see that would be nice if there was more talk about that, about the sacred aspects of the plants. And I agree with you, Sinead, that this has been going on forever. Mind-body medicine has been connected with the plants and holistic environments and how to heal within them. And I think DMT is one powerful aspect of that connection. So the powerful work that I feel like is coming about right now, and the reason I'm so grateful to be invited into your circle, is that people who are having contact experiences are connecting through different kinds of contact modalities, which you talk about, Grant. And so the thing that I think that's important to study in a medicinal way, whether it's plants, whether it's through UFO contact, is how people are accessing those advanced states of consciousness. And I don't believe that you have to take DMT to have advanced states of consciousness, but I think that's one way to get there. I think people who have contact experiences, who have been really seriously somewhat traumatized by an experience and they see it negatively, could benefit from DMT to release fear around those traumatic events. Because you hear about that on the spectrum of the continuum of people who have had contact experiences. Some people are very fearful, some people are repressing it. I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that they have had contact experiences. And so I think DMT could be a wonderful medicine to help people transform why it happened, the transformation of seeing it as a negative influence. I know that that might depart from some people's perspectives, but I think that DMT could be a healing type of medicine to work through that trauma. I spoke with somebody earlier today who's a therapist, and she uses EMDR in her practice, which is basically the synchrony between the right and the left hemispheres in ways to treat trauma. So my studies in mind-body medicine have been largely focused around trauma and how to heal trauma, which is difficult. Because anybody who's experienced severe or complex trauma, the difficult part is training the body to get out of the fight or flight, to move beyond the traditional freezing, hypervigilance, and how to do that through mind-body medicines like mindfulness, using shamanism in a way that helps people transform through their trauma into a better place. So I think that hallucinogenics have a place. They're not for everybody. The other thing I wanted to circle back around is DMT isn't for everybody. It's a pretty intense hallucinogenic, and you can get, the part of the process is to get ill, and you purge and things come out. And, anybody who talks about recreational drugs will understand that that is not an experience that you kind of, you rush towards. It is a purging. And so with the resetting of the neurogenesis, maybe DMT is a way for the body to naturally go to that next level and go to that next state through a healing mechanism that we don't necessarily understand. So the study that I've been putting together is to look at people who have had consciousness experiences that I would describe as an advanced form of consciousness through a UFO experience and what happens in the after effects. I've experienced it personally where I had a contact experience, and after it happened, it just kind of broke everything wide open and put me on that track to understand the effects. And I think that more and more information is going to come out that shows that people have had advanced consciousness, have had it since the time that they were children, and they either forgot about it or they repressed it or they just don't want to address it. And I do think that it is a form of trauma. I mean, I'm not sure how many of you agree with me on the call, but when I read John Mack's work, these are people that are unable to move beyond the episode that they feel was traumatizing. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, I always have written in contact modalities, I write a whole section on trauma, that I think trauma is part of what you need to open the filter, or to sort of, if everything's going, like they have the idea that if you're born in Hollywood with a silver spoon in your mouth, you're really not going to learn a hell of a lot. It's you need that sort of event that we see things as good or bad events, and in fact they're just events that you need. Same as I'm honored to have the people that I'm talking to here, that a lot of people will, Walter and Sinead and you both all have the experience of trying to get a hold of me, and that the time may not have been right, that everybody was trying to get a hold of me and nobody get it, but the time was right when you came along, and you came with just the material I needed just when it was right. And we've only had a few conversations, but it was almost like, wow. I mean, like when you suddenly run into these people who have exactly what you need, and yet there is this trauma part where not everything's going to go well. Or as you point out, like I think it was Sting said, if you think ayahuasca is a recreational drug, think again. I mean, it's like, who wants to, have diarrhea and throw up for 8 hours? That people have this idea, and that's where we're going to change the idea of drugs versus psychedelics. That it's not a party drug, or it's not. That's what we're doing here. That it has these very beneficial effects on resetting people and getting them going on the right track.
Well, and that's the thing that when you start to look at the similarities between the different healing modalities, while also aligning them with contact modalities, you can start to see the patterns between people who have anxiety, crippling anxiety, which is like a fear of adverse social things happening. And you start to look and connect that to different types of ways that the brain and the body respond to an environment with fear. And so I like that, I got invited onto the call about, psychedelics and hallucinogenics, because they're not my expertise, but I've really studied them and studied the neurotransmitters involved in that complete resetting process of the mind and body. Another connection is when people go through, I'm sure you've come across this, all of you probably have, is when people start to have, Alzheimer's symptoms or any kind of form of dementia where they forget, who they are. You see this reduction in symptoms, physical symptoms of what they've experienced their whole life, whether it's anxiety or depression, mood, disorders. You'll see that
That's cool.
they've shown it, yeah, through studies, that sometimes people who go through Alzheimer's, they'll lose other aspects of themselves that they have had their whole life. So in terms of the way the brain and the body have dealt with environmental stress, the mind and the body develop a pattern to deal with it. That's how you see conditions come about that are really difficult to change, because it's the way the body has kind of learned to adapt to stress. So like DMT, or in an Alzheimer's, patient who forgets really who they are, and that personality, you have a complete change in personality, you see a similar shift. The difference with DMT and other types of spiritually transformative experiences, which expand consciousness in a really big way, and you'll have personality changes as well in those experiences, like out-of-body experiences, that people come back and their perception is so shifted, but it's difficult for them to transition back into the mundane reality because they've experienced a shift. So the aspects that I have been studying have been the sense perception. And that's why I was drawn to your work, because the sense perception aspect is for sensitivity. People have extreme sensitivities. And how we connected was basically through children who might have expressive or receptive communication issues related to expanded consciousness. Now, it's really far out. It's a really far out hypothesis, but you're the only other person that I found in this kind of field who is speaking along those terms. And you're right, it could be a career killer, but I also think that maybe children who have advanced consciousness from the time they're really young and experiencing high levels of sensory perception are having a difficult time in their environment with that level of stimulation and sensory stimulation coming in. So it might shut down the language centers. It might shut down the ability to learn. And there is in all the research that I've been doing on it, there is a lot to show that anytime there's high anxiety or fear, it shuts down the learning ability. It shuts down the language centers.
Courtney?
Yeah.
Can I ask you something? Have you done any study with DMT and autism? Because I have an autistic nephew, and I was just wondering, he's never said a word in his life, but he's like, out there. Have you done anything with that? And is any breakthrough with that?
I haven't done any studies with DMT and autism, but I am studying autism and autism spectrum in terms of the consciousness aspects of children who have dyslexia, ADD and ADHD, who have any, extreme levels of anxiety, and autism. So I am looking at it, but using DMT has been really studied in controlled clinical trials. The studies that have been done at like Johns Hopkins, and it's not going to be applied to children in any time in the near future because of the extent of you're talking about an alkaloid. So it's an alkaloid, and that can be dangerous. So if you take and you study DMT with the healers, but people who have also studied medicine, DMT can be kind of dangerous because it has an alkaloid, and it's also connected to the MAOI and serotonin. And so I'm sure you're probably right that it's going to happen at some day, but because autism hasn't been studied in that way. I haven't run across it, and that's
Okay.
not part of my field studies.
Yeah.
My field studies will hopefully focus on, if I can get approval, I may have to go through a review board and everything, but my focus is really on the consciousness aspect and advanced consciousness, which I'm calling out-of-body experiences, telepathy, you know, a psychic connection to others, nonverbal intelligence, but also that's connected with any kind of label. I don't like labels, but I think those are the kind of individuals, people with autism, dyslexia, learning issues. I don't have proof of this link. It's a hypothesis at this stage, but that's really why I was drawn to Grant's work, because Grant's one of the only people that talks about these kids. And I actually think that I was probably one of them.
Yeah.
You know, I think that I, you know, was trying to communicate with members of my family about really bizarre stuff, and they didn't know, you know, they didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
Things like, you know, I would have dreams that I would wake up from and my body would be paralyzed. And so I would talk to like my sister, because I was so afraid of it. And I would say, do you have this experience where you can't, you know, move your hands? And she would say, well, sometimes, you know, if I fall asleep with my hand over the top of my head, I can't move my arm. But what I was experiencing was a full body paralysis. And so when I would wake up from those events, you know, I would be laying in bed and I would not be able to move anything, but I would remember that there would be a profound dream. So my experience has largely been through those being able to remember those events as a child and trying to understand them while also experiencing other anomaly. So does that make sense?
Yeah, well, in its own nonsensical manner, yes. Courtney, listen, I have someone, I'm not going to take up everyone's time on it now, but I have someone I need to hook up with. It's a woman, we were just talking about it today. It's a good woman friend of mine who has had a continual dream of a particular person. He's well known, I won't mention him, and he's also passed on, okay? But he's in the acting field. And she's lived a lifetime with him over and over and over again. They keep seeing each other. They keep talking to each other. It's like a continual thing. And it blew my mind to hear her. She's written a whole thing on it. She said, Doug, I don't know how this is happening, but I'm in a relationship with a person that I've never met, that I know, that I have an affinity for, a deep love for. He loves me. He's passed on, and he's come back to see me. Now he's 50 years old. He passed on when he was a kid. And now he's come to see me. And she tells me this entire story, and it's so riveting. And she's not shared it with anybody. She goes, Doug, if you know anybody, and I was actually thinking of Grant, that she is so worth a sole show, just herself, an interview, just herself with nobody else around. Or maybe you, Courtney, to just, this is an amazing story and nobody knows about it. And so she talked about the sleep paralysis. She talked about the lucid dreaming, but she said, this is not a lucid dream. She goes, I'm not in it and I know that I'm in control of it, but I wake up, and she goes, I am sure it's like, I've just spent a week with this guy. And she goes, I wake up and it's 3 minutes, 4 minutes. It's the timing. There's no time. There's no sense of time or space in this thing. So anyway, I just wanted to say, I'd love you to meet her and you to hook up. She would love you. You'd love her.
Well, thanks for saying that, because, you know, when you come out and you start talking about experiences, you know, it really comes down to beliefs, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, because the culture of the experiencers are so far out on the fringe, a lot of people stay silent about their experiences. But what I hope to do as an advocate, and being, you know, on the mind body medicine track, is to kind of break open some of those, you know, prejudices and stigmas we have. Because if you have little children who are experiencing these states of maybe advanced consciousness and they're not able to talk about it, they're really kind of alone and isolated in their experience. And I'm kind of concerned about that as a parent. Yeah. I'm looking back and kind of backtracking, and you can't really, when it comes down to memories, piece some of this stuff together and make sense out of it, because it's all autobiographical. But I was talking with my daughter before I came on this call tonight, and, you know, we were already in my family, you know, my father had an experience when he was young, and it was kind of like this anecdote that we heard about, that my dad was traveling off my mom and dad's farm. There was a green light that came over his car, and his Corvair went dead. And he was terrified. He, you know, he couldn't start it. He was a really mechanical guy. And then now my dad is passed away now, but my daughter and I had an experience when I was taking her to college. So I started to put things together. I did tell my parents what happened. I mean, my dad passed later. And so I started to think, and I was watching Grant's work, and I was starting to think, through the lucid dreaming and the work in shamanism and everything else that I've done researching this, is that our family, you know, definitely are experiencers. And it took a while for me to come to that realization, because the conscious mind just wants to reject it.
Right.
But I think after you start to piece together the lucid dreaming, I mean, that's what's been so refreshing to me about Grant's work, is that he puts it all together and says, these things aren't divided in silos. They're a continuum of processes that people like us go through. And so I want to try to be one of the people that helps, especially along the lines of helping kids, because they're going to school, they're trying to make sense of life. Their parents might not understand what's going on, but if we could kind of carve out a safe space for them to talk about what's going on without labels, I think that would be a really great thing to provide as a service through mind body medicine, because it's possible.
Courtney, I wish that you were there when I was a kid, because I was that kid. That was me, 100%. That was me. I was sensitive. I was having all these crazy experiences. I couldn't explain it to anybody. If I tried to, I was dismissed. It's a very lonely place to be. So the fact that you're thinking about that is really, really wonderful. And I hope you're successful in creating that environment for children, because, you know, we need to know when we're that age, and we're so able to be receptive, right? We're so able to be receptive. We're sponges, and we're so connected to our instincts and our pure consciousness. And, you know, we're so sensitive and able to understand things on a really deep level without the thoughts and all the words and thinking and language and conditioning getting in the way. It's such a valuable opportunity, right? And it's just such a shame that so many of these kids, I'm sure, who are, as you're saying, experiencers and are in the UFO community, it's such a shame that opportunity is missed out, because I mean, it took me such a huge amount of hard work and a very big, I call it my cosmic frying pan experience, where I was basically bombed over the head by ETs saying to me, you know, you need to make this a part of your life. Like, you can't ignore that this is who you are anymore. But it took me a really, really long time to get here, you know, and I've often thought about that. I've often thought, oh, it would have been so wonderful if I'd been able to have a different experience. So I think it's great you're doing that. And I have to go. So I just want to quickly say thank you to everybody for this wonderful conversation, and Grant for starting this. And Grant wanted me to mention an event that's happening tomorrow night. It's April 23rd right now. I don't know if there's any point in saying that it's happening tomorrow night, because we don't know when this is going to be posted online. But I really encourage anybody who's watching to go online to the McKenna Foundation and just look at what they're doing, because especially right now during this time of the COVID virus, everything's online, and there's such incredible content online right now. There's some really, really wonderful conversations happening about psychedelics and what they're doing in the medical community, in the spiritual community. There's just so much wonderful stuff online right now, and the McKenna Academy is bringing a lot of people together. And there's Wade Davis. I mean, there's just really incredible people talking about this stuff. So I'm going to say that I'm just going to leave it there. Go to the McKenna Academy website, look at their events, join psychedelic communities of you know, people who are talking about this. It's just such a great opportunity to connect and go into that space together.
Yeah,
so,
we might try to find a link, because you and I have signed up for it. So there must be a link where we'll give everybody the link. I think it takes place at 7 Central tomorrow, somewhere. It's about the same time our event started today. So thanks for that. We'll do that, and you can take off. And I guess we should maybe shut it down. I just want to make a point to Courtney. You were mentioning the Alzheimer's thing, which is kind of weird, because I was trained as a healer for the Bankston healing method, if you know what that's all about. And Bankston, so I went to Chicago, and the top trainer, when you talk about somebody who's going through anxiety or depression or whatever, I always say the question, so who's going through the anxiety? And they say, well, I am. Well, who am I? I am the ego. And so when I asked the head trainer, I said to her, I said, what is the most successful thing that you can do in Bankston? She says, number one, Alzheimer's is number one, and animals. They both have the same thing. They don't have an ego. The ego is gone and all that stuff goes away. The anxiety goes away, the depression goes away because the ego is no longer there. And they say that's the whole idea behind the Bankston thing, is to get the ego out of the way. And that's when you get the healer out of the way and the energy flows. So it's kind of, she actually did a lecture. I've got her PowerPoint slides on this whole thing about the unbelievable success they have with Alzheimer patients. And she said her claim was, it like animals, it comes down to the lack of ego.
Right. And you see that happen in spiritually transformative experiences. You see it happen in NDEs where there's a full on transformation because of this expanded consciousness, where you get the answer to the universe. You're one with all cosmic intelligence. You have this expansion. And so that shift from the expansion away it's phenomenal. The only issue and downside of it is kind of integrating back with society once you've experienced it, and how to do that without feeling, sensitive.
It is like you get the whole thing with out-of-body experience people, that 75% of out-of-body experience people get divorced. I mean, and a lot of them commit suicide because it's you're not the same person.
Exactly. And so I brought up the Alzheimer's parallel because it's another phenomenon that's happening in a medical setting where you have somebody who kind of loses a lot of those symptoms around depression, anxiety. It's out there. It's well known. And the other thing that's really interesting about our discussion, just briefly, is that with certain types of hallucinogenics, this is a really important part. When you're experiencing that oneness experience, it's like the samadhi experience. It has a personal meaning. It's the whole body. It's not just your eyes are closed in DMT. So that's the other thing. You're not tripping with your eyes open. Your eyes are closed. So you're going within to the innerscapes. And so that's the profound aspect that I think when people talk about hallucinogenics, when someone has a tumor in their visual cortex, depending on where it is, the information that streams into the visual cortex as the mind tries to make sense of it, you can tell what kind of hallucination it is based off of the area where the tumor or an injury was, or if there is an organic disease happening, by the hallucination, what is experienced. So some people will see in their right hemisphere only the left side. Vice versa. You sent me that link about the person who has epilepsy when they split the corpus callosum and they have better functionality on the right and left side. So it's the same with hallucinations. When somebody's having a hallucination, they'll have dysfunction. And when you have a DMT experience, you don't see that dysfunction. It's a holistic, meaningful, full embodied experience for the person, which shows that it's not a negative. It's a positive healing function. So I think those are the ways that you can use DMT to see parallel tracks and how the brain is processing it when you use it, and the outcome of how beautiful it is and how you reduce symptoms after you take it. That's where I think the proof is in the pudding.
I wanted to mention something, and Courtney, maybe you know it, and maybe somebody else on the group here knows something called Salvia divinorum.
Salvia, yes.
Okay. And Grant, not that I'm trying to get you into the drug world, but I wanted to mention something to you. Salvia divinorum, I still have it. It's actually legal in New Jersey. And there's actually, if you go to the website where you can get Salvia divinorum, it's legal in certain areas. And I got it on my shelf for a long time. I haven't used it in years. But Salvia divinorum, you would take a little bit, put a little water in. It's very strong. It's like in grain alcohol. You put it under your tongue and you hold it under your tongue for as long as you can. It burns. But you'll have a wonderful, at least I'm speaking for myself, you'll have a wonderful hallucinogenic experience for 20 minutes to a half hour, and that's it. And then it's gone. And the last one that I did, the back of my head peeled open, and a blob of what I considered to be time and space reality, all as a taffy. So time was hooked in with material, and space and matter were all together, and I saw it as one glob of connectedness, the only way I can describe it. And I went, oh, now I see. I went, oh, now I see. Time is linked to this whole thing. There's no free time, and it's just part of matter and part of thought, and I had these great visions, and it only lasted 20 minutes. So, Grant, you don't have to vomit. You can get right into it. And so I just wanted to mention
different experiences on Salvia too. I've had friends who have taken Salvia and it didn't go well with them. So I think it does depend on the person.
Yeah.
And I'm super sensitive to any kind of drug, even like a Tylenol or an ibuprofen. So it really does depend on the person.
Yeah.
I think with how deeply affected you are with some of those adverse symptoms when you're ingesting. So maybe there's a sensitivity scale in terms of
Courtney, do you think it has anything to do with the fact that I did, earlier in the talk here, when you weren't here, I talked about my LSD experiences, and I had about 10 or 12 or 15 of them, I forget, mushrooms, all hallucinogenics. I'm not a drug person. So I wonder if my Salvia experience has any kind of connection to that. I already came in the door already from hallucinogenics.
I think it does. And you want to know why I think it does? Because when you take that leap of faith, and when you, back in the day, when you used to take like drugs at college or whatever on the party scene, there would be this group of people that were like hardened, they'd gone through the process. They knew they were going to be okay. Right.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of fear that kind of builds up in your mind beforehand. So I think once you've gone through the process and you've come out the other side, no matter what happens, I mean, we had times, when I did psychedelics back in the 90s, where we'd have a group of people and somebody would just lose their shit.
Yeah.
They would just feel or fear that, somebody was coming after them, or you'd see paranoia. And so somebody was always like the caretaker that was like, chill, man, everything's cool. It's, it's going to be all right. I think that has a lot to do with it. Once your neurotransmitters have gone through the experience, you've seen stuff, you get that sense of trust with yourself. It's a self-trust thing.
Sure.
Don't you think that you're going to be okay? And so it's
just
different types, you're talking about chemicals versus natural things that grow wild. I think the most fascinating study, if we could pull it off, would be to get people who are experiencers, who have had phenomenal experiences and shifts in consciousness, and do something like that, where you take a different type of hallucinogenic and see the patterns and what people see,
right,
how they feel, the messages that they get. Because I do think with different sensory perception that streams inward, everybody's different. So some people see vivid things, other people have profound feelings in that kinesthetic body awareness. The interesting thing about what you're saying is that, you kind of remembered. And I think your body does remember when you go through like that. It's a chemical, and I think when you're talking about neurotransmitters that are flowing in that way, it's your body responding to something. So once you've been through it before, you're going to remember going through it again.
Sure. Probably made it easier for me, and maybe made the experience great, and like no fear. Like I was like, oh, whatever, 15, 20 minutes. This is a cakewalk for me,
I have to tell you, not doing any drugs. Like I did drugs in college, and I, experimented like any normal Pennsylvania farm girl, going away to college, but I didn't do any drugs for a long time. But then when I went through the shamanic training, and I was willing to like try some things, because the idea about it is that it's natural, and that shifted my thinking from it being dangerous, was radical. Because even doing a little bit of cannabis from the 90s to what they're doing with cannabis now, it's like these guys have this stuff down to a science. It's powerful. It's powerful. So I'm even cautious about doing anything like that, because it's so different than what it was before, and it's so much more advanced in terms of the plant's effect on the mind, on the body. So I'm pretty cautious about that kind of thing.
Do you think that fear plays a part, like this idea that you manifest, the idea that if you see grays, you may be manifesting fear, or that you take in? So if you go in a fearful state, you could have a real bad experience. Whereas if you go in with a positive setting, all that kind of stuff, that you're potentially gonna have a better go of it.
Yeah, well, I definitely depart from some camps out there that, you know, you have a lot more influence over this in terms of your perspective and your outlook. And I do think that one of the things that's so interesting about DMT is that it can completely transform.
Yeah.
That's what I've said. I think that it can completely transform fear-based thought patterns, which is, it's incredible. That's an incredible form of medicine, because I do believe that our personality influences, and our stress that we come against in our daily life does really influence our mind and our brain and our body. And there's so much we don't know about, you know, mind over matter. But like Sinead was saying, people who go through that healing process, you're talking about having to be cracked open. It cracks open the fear-based mentality that you need to stay in that same level of consciousness, and shows you a new reality. And so I do think that 100% some of these experiences are dependent upon your own process of what you see. Why do some people see elves and little people and fairies? Why do other people see lights in the sky? Why do other people see things in their bedroom at night? And I think that fear-based mentality, if your mind does not recognize what you're seeing, it's going to put what your belief system believes it to be on top of it. And if it's fear-based, that's what you're going to experience.
Yeah. Doug, you'll want to know that DMT, you're talking 20 minutes. DMT is like 7 to 10 minutes, and it's 6 to 7 times as powerful as ayahuasca. So it's like, that's one of the things they talk about. It's like, you're going there whether you want to go or not. You're going to see the elves. You're going to see the little beings. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's like like a rocket to the other side of the universe instantaneously. That's sort of what they describe. And
well, and I think that's why people are afraid. I think that's why you feel that fear building up to it, because it's out of your control. And if you're not in a good state of mind, who the hell wants to be, you know, in a bad trip for even 3 to 5 minutes when you feel like you're out of control? But the good thing about DMT is you hear the positive aspects when you break through the fear barrier. And that's what stays.
Well, the fact that I had, 24-hour LSD trip, I can do 20 minutes standing on my head. I mean, that seems like very, very simple. But at the same time, yes, I mean, I never went to the DMT. I've never found the need to go there. And I absolutely abhor vomiting. So I don't want to vomit. I don't want to get sick. I'm not there anymore. I pretty much came this way and have had this journey. So it's still in me. I still see the world through it. I still think through it. It's in my art, it's in my music, it's in my life, and it's already made a great mark as far as I'm concerned. So, I've thought about that. Hey, one question, Courtney, did you ever hear of something called Zapita?
Oh my God. That's so weird that you just mentioned that, because I just had talked to somebody about that today.
Wow, that's crazy. Right.
That is crazy. And I also have friends who live down in Costa Rica, and they've done the frogs.
Yeah.
The frog, where they do the frog stuff, and then they,
Okay, so what do they say about the frog stuff? Because that's supposed to be like you go into a field of pure consciousness. There's no form anymore.
That's out there. Like I was told from
out there.
when I brought, not that everything else isn't out there. The reason why I brought it up is that I have a friend in Mexico, teaches yoga. And last time I was there, I own a place in Playa del Carmen in Mexico with a buddy of mine. And last time we were there, he said, he goes, listen, he just couldn't tell us enough. He goes, I've always theorized it, but I finally did it. I did Zapita. I did the skin of the frog, or the poison, or whatever you want to call it. He did it. He said, this experience, he goes, now I know it. He goes, I always just believed it. The oneness, afterlife, majesty, everything he could explain. He goes, I always only believed it. Now I know it. He says, it's the most incredible thing I've ever done in my life. And I think was pretty well experienced in a lot of things. So that's what I heard about Zapita. That's what I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, I know a couple of friends down in Costa Rica who were providing, that healing experience for people. And they did it in their private, residence, kind of as a retreat. And yeah, there's not a lot of people, but I've heard a couple people who have gone to their retreat have done really well and come out the other side.
Is it DMT is the What's
I
in
don't think I don't think DMT is the compound that's in the frog. In the frog, they take something off the frog,
Yeah.
off the skin of the frog, and then they ingest it, and it takes like 20 minutes for the effects to start. And then there's definitely hallucinogenic type experience. They feel a samadhi type experience of being connected with all of nature. There are some physical effects, like gastrointestinal things that are connected to it. It's not my area of expertise, but I have heard about it.
Wow.
And, I think that when you start talking about the plant medicines, there's so many unique plants and their constituents that, interact with neurotransmitters in interesting ways, specifically targeting specific types of neurotransmitters. I think there's a lot we don't know, especially about the Amazonian medicines. And I think DMT is having its moment right now. And I think that we're hitting critical mass because people are finding out about it and they're willing to do it because of, I think, the anecdotal stories of people's profound shifts.
Yeah.
They feel.
Can you imagine an animal biting that frog, and then what happens to that animal?
I've wondered about it. I mean, I've wondered about all this stuff and coffee and how animals, respond. And
Yeah,
it's all connected.
and even DMT, whoever figured out to put plant or tree number one together with the other, and because one have to allow the DMT to be absorbed, because without the one plant, the DMT won't be absorbed by your stomach. So you need two components to make it.
Right. That goes into absorption, and there's different
ayahuasca.
types.
Ayahuasca.
Yeah, and there's different kinds of plants. Like ayahuasca is made out of the tea, and so the people who are in the Amazonian basin who are using it are making the tea a certain way. Then there's also the songs, the acaros that sing with it as a protection over the spirit as people are going through this flight in spirit and contacting, the entities or the spirit of Mother Ayahuasca and the Lady of the Forest. I mean, so there's this whole process, but the actual chemical constituents, they have it down, how it's absorbed. It's like there are specific types of plants that are fat soluble in water and others that aren't. And it gets all into the chemistry and the science of how you have to ingest it in order for it to be absorbed by the body. And some plants, not even, ayahuasca, but other plants, they don't get absorbed. Like, what is it? It's thistle. Thistle is not soluble through water. So if you take a milk thistle pill, it doesn't get absorbed because of the solubility between water, as the water is the medium. So in the plant of ayahuasca, they're taking it and they're putting it into the water as a way to be able to absorb it through ingestion. The guy that Grant referred me to, he wants people to be able to put it in an IV and ingest it for long periods of time. And I don't know how I felt about that. My gut was like,
yeah. I'm not a needle guy anyway.
How would that work? I mean, how is your mind, if the drug in taking it in its natural state only lasts for 3 to 5 minutes? I got to believe Mother Nature's got a reason for that. Like, short exposure, like, here, human, take 3 to 5 minutes, go through this expansion, where if you're undergoing long periods where you're going to be connected to it, how is that going to affect? I mean,
you also have to remember, I think everyone has to remember, is that you have to return to a rather mundane, unenlightened world, and you have to live within it. And we all pretty much live a repetitious, patterned world. Everything, no matter what you do, it's a repetition. Absolutely everything. No matter how great your job is, how great your friends, your wife, your husband, your this, your that. After a while, it's repetition, 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 and it's like the same thing over and over again. I think the hallucinogens help me with that, because I journey every night, and Grant, I think I told you this, and Desta, I think I told you this, I spend most of my time at night reading and listening to near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. It's my calling. I love it. I love everybody that's gone somewhere and come back to tell me about the elders and the angels and Archangel Michael and Gabriel. It's incredible. Even a guy that experienced a near-death experience that's a Muslim that has no connection to Catholicism sees Archangel Michael and Gabriel. It was like unbelievable. He's like, I couldn't believe it. So that's the stuff I get called to, and I think that's from my early exposure to all these.
The one thing we could add to that, though, is it's one thing to read other people's experiences, but when you do the DMT, you're going there. It's like you die. That's the whole point, is that your ego is completely dissolved. You are there. Then it's like you having the experience rather than reading about somebody else having the experience. And you're in there. It's almost like we're doing all this stuff where we're looking at UFOs and who are the aliens or whatever. And it's like to be in the field where you go like, and that's, I think what that Andrew guy was talking about. He said the overwhelming thing where when he first saw the beings, he went, oh, there are actually higher dimensional beings that are really, really smart. This is not made up. And it's one thing to think about it. It's another thing to actually be face to face with a very highly intelligent being that is talking to you and scolding you or doing whatever.
One more thing that I want to say about DMT that's really important about the alkaloid is it's really a heavy thing. So the other thing why naturalistically there's only 3 to 5 minutes of experience in that intense state is because chemically alkaloids can kill you. And so that's the other thing. I've had a couple people who have wanted to do ayahuasca, and I talked to a friend of mine, she's an MD, and the one person had serious issues, physical issues like epilepsy and other things that were fragile, really fragile physically. And so I talked with my friend who was a doctor, and we kind of hashed it out. And because we decided that the alkaloid was way too heavy, she could possibly die undergoing an ayahuasca experience. Wow. And so it is a serious drug. And so it shouldn't be taken lightly if there are physical issues that somebody might not pull out of. Now, there's been documentaries about people who have gone down to the Amazon and they died, going through a process like this. And, the healers look at it like, okay, this is meant to be, this is part of the process, and, you can't control it. And so my feeling is I would never want to take anybody and undergo that experience or recommend it, especially if there's a physical condition that makes them, really fragile. Then ayahuasca might be their last experience.
Doug
so
plays hockey. He's okay.
I wanted to say that too, that it is a really heavy alkaloid and it can be dangerous.
Yeah, but Doug plays hockey. He's okay.
Yeah, good. If you're a hockey player, you're good. You're all good.
I take it during hockey. No worries. By the way,
I'm talking about people who are going to see this later, like, be aware.
Courtney, in brief, what is kratom? I have it, but I've never taken it.
Kratom is not something that also you want to take lightly, because there was a shipment of kratom that came over from, I think, China, and it had been tampered with. Did you see that in the news? It was a national news story. And so kratom came over and it had been tainted, and a bunch of people died. And kratom was kind of like a subculture drug that a lot of people were getting access to, kind of like how ketamine started. Do you remember ketamine was kind of a subculture thing that people were taking at parties and stuff? Kratom was the same kind of way, but it I don't know exactly what neurotransmitters it works on and why people were attracted to that drug. I just know that it's unstable right now because the way it's coming through, it doesn't have integrity.
Hey, Grant, Grant, who was using kratom? John Lear. And John Lear was using it for pain.
Really?
Yeah. And that's where I learned about it. I was reading on his site. He had a whole bunch of people talking about the wonders of kratom. But I ordered kratom 5 years ago, and it's in a sealed pouch, and I've never opened it. And it's sitting there ever since then because I thought maybe at some point I'd want to use it, but I've never wanted to touch it. So I think it was called Red Dawn, something from Vietnam or whatever. But whatever it is, I have it. So
maybe it depends on the supplier, because I'll tell you that that it depends on you're getting it and whether they have integrity. I personally wouldn't take kratom.
No, I'm not going to take it. No.
Yeah, I've heard about it, and I've heard that it was definitely a subculture thing. I think it depends on the person and what experience they're looking for. I'll give you a good example. I was hiking in the Alaskan hiking trails up here, and we have a mushroom called the amanita. And the amanita is the classic mushroom that you hear and see on Alice in Wonderland.
Okay.
And it's that big red cap with white spores coming out of it, and it is intimidating as hell. but it's also fascinating because it's beautiful. And so people don't know a lot about Amanita muscaria in terms of, what we know about DMT now and the experience. So anyway, I was hiking here and I was seeing a mushroom hunter and I was like, so have you seen any Amanita and have you taken any? And he's like, I don't need that experience. And I was like, okay, dude. Yeah, he was looking for like the boleta mushrooms, that are like shiitakes, the shiitake mushroom. But I think it's what you're drawn to. And I think that's an intuitive sense, right? About what your medicine really is. You're going to be drawn to it.
Beautiful.
I just want to jump in here as we come to a close and make sure that Grant doesn't get sued. As a disclaimer, look, there is a lot of fun recreational use of hallucinogens. There is a lot of healing use of the sacramental drugs. But especially if you have the potential or have been diagnosed with any type of what we would call mental illness, you need to be very, very careful with this. And even if you haven't, you need to be very, very careful. Look at the concerns we have over the supply chain. Look at the concerns that we have about micro versus macro dosing. Look at the way different people react. You really need to have a supervised environment. You have to have an informed and educational approach to these things. And sadly enough, we don't have the access to those kinds of medical and clinical and even anecdotal uses with family and friends that we could, trade stories and have safe encounters with this. So please, as much fun as it can be, it can be horrible.
Yeah.
I had an acid experience that could have killed 5 or 6 people. We were driving in my wife's car and we took acid and we were in this beautiful area with dogwoods blooming and whatnot. And no one's getting off. And all of a sudden I run a stop sign I never saw. And there's only the luck of God or the fates kept me from massacring people.
Yeah.
So I really want you to be careful out there. Get yourself into a place where there's supervision and experience. Fortunately, for instance, here in Florida, we have an ayahuasca soul retreat 200 or 300 miles north of me. And these people have been down this road for so long, as Sinead will tell you. I mean, they have more experience with it than the MD community has with it. So as a disclaimer, as much as you have heard about us saying funny things and talking about how much fun it could be, and also an occasion how horrible it could be, please be very, very careful out there. And one other thing, Grant, would you do me a favor and quit switching your background? I kept thinking I was having flashbacks. It's really. And lastly, you'll have to ask you'll have to have Doug. Doug and I had a beautiful experience yesterday without any drugs. At least I didn't have any. He might have.
No,
but
I didn't.
You did? Okay. We had 4 grays. We had a conversation with 4 grays. And I'll leave it with that.
Beautiful. I think what I work on, I think Courtney works on as well, is the research. Like, we try to stick with the research that's being done at Johns Hopkins or at NYU or some of these places where they're doing this. And at Johns Hopkins, they do the high dose psilocybin, where they use for depression and alcoholism and smoking and people dying of cancer and all this kind of stuff. And they have an 8-hour course that you have to go through. And if you have any psychiatric disorder, they will not let you take it. So it's a very, very strict thing. But I think we can, whatever we said tonight, you can look at the research. And I think Courtney would agree that the research that's being done today in labs under very strict conditions is absolutely going to change the world. The stuff that they're discovering there is stunning. And that's the words they use, stunning, the results that they're getting.
I think I will say this just as a finishing and a closing, less about the chemical part of the hallucinogenic, but the effect and the profound effect that's happening, where you see these people who have been completely healed are starting movements. So there's movements to provide access. There's an ayahuasca center in Seattle now, or they're opening soon, and they're doing that underneath the religious church. There's another man, a profound thought leader on ayahuasca, who started a healing center in New York City. And so the people who have done it aren't just doing it for personal pleasure.
Yeah.
They're also creating a movement to allow the tidal wave to move forward, and they're doing really good causes that are providing resources for people who can have access. And so I think that you have to see what individuals who are coming out of the ayahuasca experience are doing, and it's not just for their self. They're doing work for the community and for the environment and a lot of other good causes. So it's really positive to look at those aspects of it, not just the research, but the research is showing, the field studies on DMT are showing incredible therapeutic effects.
And we have made the move almost like with marijuana. I was just in Colorado, and they have allowed psilocybin now for treatment centers with psilocybin. Yes. So you have this movement of people saying, why should we get stuck with antidepressants that really don't work when these people claim that this stuff is working? And so you're starting to see this groundswell of people who are doing it academically and very tight controls, who are bringing these clinics, whether they're in Seattle or Florida has them, Colorado, where you're starting to see this movement from the bottom up that says there are other options that people should be able to have the right to go to.
Yeah, there's definitely a grassroots aspect to this. Like New York, Doug, is definitely an epicenter where people who have done ayahuasca there are whole collectives of plant medicine people who are there on the ground, who are advocating for this as a grassroots thing. I think it's amazing that you have, major medical centers studying it at the same time. So there's a convergence happening. It's going to be really interesting to see how those mesh up.
All we need to do now is find a way to get all world leaders in one room and do DMT for an afternoon.
Well, this is the kind of a joke. I think I was telling Desta about this joke. We have the Republican conservatives here in Manitoba, and we legalized marijuana in Canada, and there was this massive fight by the conservatives to stop this. This is going to be terrible. We're going to have people driving off the roads and this, and clinics and people overdosing and all this kind of stuff. And they fought it tooth and nail. And so when it was legalized, and then we suddenly had the COVID thing break loose here in Manitoba, they have only essential businesses are allowed to stay open. And two of the essential businesses that are allowed to stay open are alcohol stores and marijuana stores. And after all the fights that they put up to stop marijuana, now suddenly they're making money on it. So the government is part of the thing that we have to overcome, is that they will try to block this, and it's like a process like everything else. It will, in its time, it will come when the time is right for it to come. And if we believe, then we just try to promote what we think is good for the world, and eventually when the time is right, it'll come.
That's true.
Spoken with like a true wisdom.
Yeah. Okay, we'll leave it at that. And Desta, and I'm really happy that Courtney showed up, because we've now got an academic. Because a lot of the UFO community, we really have just sort of people who are sort of interested, that aren't academics, and anybody who's an academic is really in the UFO community is in the consciousness. So now we've got an academic that's in the consciousness field, and I'm really happy that you've joined us.
Yeah, I think that's going to change. I think it's going to be more accepted. That's my part of the grassroots effort in that effort. So
great.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Desta.
Thank you for showing up, and we'll do it again.
Courtney.
sounds good. Good night.
Courtney, we'll talk sometime. I want to talk to you about my